Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford. Each night, as darkness crept across the borrowed farmstead, I'd find myself pressed against the living room window, watching the cornfield with eyes that burned from exhaustion and dread. The scarecrow was coming again tonight. I could feel it in my bones, the way some people sense incoming storms. My name is Marcus, and 3 weeks ago I thought I'd stumbled into paradise when my college buddy Jake offered me his family's old farm to house sit for the summer. The place sat 40 miles outside town, surrounded by endless rows of corn that whispered secrets to the wind. Jake mentioned his grandfather had worked this land for decades before passing last winter, leaving behind a property that needed watching while the family decided what to do with it. The farmhouse was simple but comfortable. White clapboard siding weathered to a soft gray wraparound porch with creaking boards and windows that rattled when trucks passed on the distant highway. A massive kitchen dominated the back of the house, complete with an ancient refrigerator that hummed and wheezed like an old man's breathing. The corn maze stretched in every direction beyond the backyard, 7 feet tall and dense enough to swallow sound. Jake had casually mentioned the scarecrow during our brief handover tour, pointing toward a distant figure planted deep in the corn rows. Even in daylight, something about that motionless sentinel had made my stomach tighten. Its face was wrapped in yellowed cloth, body stuffed with straw that poked through tears and faded overalls. Crude wooden arms stretched toward the sky like a crucified prisoner. That first night, I'd barely given it a thought. I'd settled into the comfortable couch, cracked open a beer, and watched old movies on my laptop until my eyelids grew heavy. Sleep came easily in the profound silence of the countryside. The first sign something was wrong came with my morning coffee. I'd stumbled to the kitchen in my boxers, desperate for caffeine, when I noticed muddy footprints leading from the back door to the refrigerator. Not just any mud, thick black earth mixed with what looked like decomposed plant matter. The prints were roughly human-shaped, but wrong somehow. Too long and narrow, with distinct toe impressions that seemed to dig deeper than normal feet should. My first thought was that Jake had stopped by during the night to grab something, though I couldn't understand why he'd track mud through his grandmother's pristine kitchen. I'd called him that morning, asking if he'd been by the house. His confusion sounded genuine when he told me he was 3 states away visiting family. When I mentioned the muddy prints, he'd laughed nervously and suggested maybe I'd sleepwalked. But I knew my own footprints, and these weren't mine. I spent that day cleaning the kitchen floor on my hands and knees, scrubbing until my fingers pruned and the bleach smell burned my nostrils. Yet even after every trace of mud disappeared, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had violated the sanctity of the house while I slept, helpless and unaware. The second night brought worse discoveries. I'd woken to the sound of my refrigerator door hanging open, its pale light spilling across the kitchen tiles like a supernatural beacon. My heart hammered against my ribs as I crept down the hallway, bare feet silent on the cold linoleum. The fridge hummed louder now, working overtime to cool the escaped air. Inside, nestled between a carton of milk and leftover pizza, I found them, dozens of corn kernels scattered across the shelves, some still attached to fragments of husk. They weren't there when I'd grabbed a beer before bed. I was certain of that. The kernels looked fresh, almost wet, and when I touched one, my fingertip came away sticky with an unidentifiable film. Sleep proved impossible after that. I'd paced the house until dawn, checking and rechecking every door and window. All remained locked from the inside. No broken glass, no scratched wood around the locks, no sign of forced entry. Yet someone, or something, had been inside my temporary sanctuary. The corn kernels continued appearing nightly, sometimes in the fridge, sometimes scattered across the kitchen counter like offerings left by an unseen visitor. I started staying awake, positioning myself where I could watch both the kitchen and the cornfield through the back windows. That's when I first saw it move. The scarecrow stood in the same spot where Jake had pointed it out, roughly 100 yards from the house. In daylight, It appeared motionless, just another piece of farm equipment designed to frighten birds. But as darkness fell on my fourth night there, I watched its silhouette shift against the star-filled sky. The movement was subtle at first, a slight turn of the head, an adjustment of posture that could have been tricks of shadow and moonlight. I pressed my face against the cool glass, breath fogging the window as I strained to see clearly. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out the gentle rustling of corn leaves. Then it stepped forward. The motion was unmistakably deliberate, impossibly fluid for something that should have been an inanimate collection of straw and fabric. One moment it stood rooted among the corn stalks. The next it had moved 3 feet closer to the house. My throat constricted, trapping my breath like a physical object lodged in my windpipe. I fumbled for the heavy flashlight Jake had left on the kitchen counter, hands trembling so violently I nearly dropped it twice. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating swaying corn but nothing else. The scarecrow had vanished. My legs gave out, sending me sliding down the kitchen wall until I sat on the floor, flashlight clutched against my chest. The rational part of my mind insisted I'd imagined the whole thing. Stress, isolation, and too little sleep combining to create hallucinations. But my body knew better. Every nerve ending screamed that something predatory lurked just beyond the light, watching and waiting. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. Instead, I maintained a vigil by the window, flashlight at the ready, eyes burning from the strain of peering into darkness. The scarecrow remained motionless during these observations, but each morning brought fresh evidence of nocturnal visitation. Muddy footprints, scattered corn kernels, and increasingly, something far more disturbing. Seeds had begun sprouting throughout the house. I first noticed them on the 6th morning, tiny green shoots pushing through cracks in the kitchen tile grout. By afternoon, more had appeared near the baseboards in the living room. The next day brought a cluster growing from beneath the bathroom threshold. They looked like corn seedlings in their earliest stage, pale and fragile, but undeniably alive. The sight of plants growing inside the house triggered a primal revulsion that made my skin crawl. This wasn't just trespassing or vandalism. This was colonization. Something was transforming the farmhouse into an extension of the cornfield, blurring the boundaries between cultivated land and human habitation. I spent entire days pulling up the seedlings, only to find twice as many the following morning. They grew with supernatural speed, some reaching 2 inches overnight despite having no soil or adequate light. When I tried to block potential entry points with caulk and steel wool, new sprouts simply appeared elsewhere, as if the entire house had become fertile ground for whatever force was orchestrating this invasion. Sleep deprivation was taking its toll. My hands shook constantly now, and my vision blurred around the edges. Simple tasks like making coffee or checking my phone required enormous concentration. I'd started talking to myself, having conversations with an empty house just to hear human voices, even if they were my own. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. Something kept me anchored to that place, a morbid fascination with whatever was happening. I needed to understand what wanted something from me, what message it was trying to convey through scattered corn and impossible plant growth. The revelation came on the 10th night, when I finally caught the scarecrow in motion. I'd positioned myself in the darkened living room, flashlight off, watching through a gap in the curtains. The moon hung fat and yellow above the cornfield, casting everything in shades of amber and black. For hours, nothing moved except the gentle swaying of corn stalks in the evening breeze. Then I saw it emerge from the maze. The figure moved with purpose, no longer the shambling gait I'd glimpsed in peripheral vision. This was deliberate, measured, almost ritualistic. The cloth-wrapped face remained turned toward the house as it approached, and though I couldn't see features beneath the yellowed fabric, I felt the weight of its attention like a physical pressure against my chest. My finger found the flashlight switch, but I hesitated. Previous attempts to illuminate the approaching figure had caused it to vanish, but tonight felt different. Tonight it seemed to want to be seen. The scarecrow reached the porch steps and began to climb. Each footfall sent vibrations through the floorboards beneath my feet. I bit down on my knuckle to prevent myself from screaming, tasting blood as my teeth broke skin. The rational voice in my head had gone completely silent. overwhelmed by pure animal terror that made my vision tunnel and my hearing fade to a high-pitched whine. It stopped directly outside the living room window where I crouched, separated from me by only a sheet of glass and a few feet of space. Up close, I could see that the cloth wrapping its face was stained with dark patches that could have been dirt or something worse. Straw poked through numerous tears in its clothing, and beneath the loose fabric, I glimpsed what looked like pale, root-like appendages instead of normal limbs. We regarded each other in silence, predator and prey frozen in mutual recognition. My lungs burned from holding my breath, but I couldn't risk the sound of exhaling. The scarecrow raised one arm, or what passed for an arm, and pressed it against the window glass. The appendage spread like water, flowing across the surface in patterns that reminded me of growing vines. Then it spoke, though its words came not through the glass but from everywhere at once, vibrating through the floorboards and walls, as if the entire house had become a resonating chamber. It told me about the grandfather who'd worked this land, about the bargain he'd made during the worst drought in county history, about the price paid for green fields and abundant harvests, and the inheritance that came with borrowed property. It explained the corn kernels and sprouting seeds, the muddy footprints and midnight visitations, all preparations for a transformation that had been postponed but never canceled. I understood then that I hadn't simply been house-sitting. I'd been selected, prepared, cultivated like any other crop. The scarecrow wasn't hunting me. It was harvesting me. But understanding didn't mean acceptance. As the creature's appendage began to seep through microscopic gaps around the window frame, I found my legs and ran. I bolted through the house, grabbing my car keys from the kitchen counter, and burst through the front door into the humid night air. My Honda started on the second try, headlights cutting through darkness as I reversed down the gravel driveway with reckless speed. In the rearview mirror, I saw the scarecrow standing on the porch, motionless once again, watching my escape with infinite patience. I drove until dawn, stopping only when I reached the interstate truck stop where I now sit, writing this account on napkins with a borrowed pen. My hands have finally stopped shaking, though I jump at every sound. The rational world feels fragile now, like tissue paper stretched over something vast and hungry. I've tried calling Jake 3 times, but his number goes straight to voicemail. Part of me wonders if there ever was a Jake, if the keys and address were simply placed where I'd find them by something that needed a new caretaker for its impossible harvest. The corn season isn't over yet. Somewhere 40 miles from here, a farmhouse sits empty, seeds sprouting in the darkness, waiting for the next person desperate enough to accept borrowed paradise without questioning the price. And in the cornfield, patient as seasons, a scarecrow tends its crop of human dreams. Story 2. The fluorescent lights hummed their sickly tune in the basement corridor of St. Mary's General Hospital, casting an intermittent greenish pallor over everything they touched. It was past 3 in the morning, and the building had settled into that peculiar silence that only came during the graveyard shift. Not quite empty, but hollow enough to make every sound echo with unnatural clarity. I had been working night shifts in the laundry department for 6 months now, ever since my divorce left me needing the extra pay differential. The basement levels were always understaffed after midnight, leaving me alone with industrial washers, mountains of soiled linens, and the constant background symphony of mechanical breathing from the building's ventilation system. Most nights, I could lose myself in the routine, letting muscle memory guide my hands while my mind wandered elsewhere. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the shadows seemed deeper, and the familiar sounds carried an edge that made the hair on my arms stand at attention. The autoclave sat silent in the corner like a metallic beast, its massive cylindrical chamber reflecting the stuttering fluorescent light in distorted waves across its polished steel surface. During the day, it roared with superheated steam, sterilizing surgical instruments and equipment with violent efficiency. Now, in the dead hours of morning, it loomed cold and motionless, yet somehow more unsettling in its dormancy. There was something about its presence that felt watchful, as if the machine retained some memory of the heat and pressure it contained. I was folding a stack of bed sheets beside it when the sound started. soft at first, barely distinguishable from the building's ambient noise. The rhythmic scraping of rubber against linoleum, slow and deliberate. Chinelos, I thought absently, recognizing the distinctive shuffle of hospital slippers dragging across the floor. Someone walking the halls above me, probably a patient unable to sleep, pacing the corridors as so many did during these restless hours. My hands continued their mechanical work, smoothing wrinkles from white cotton, stacking the finished sheets in neat piles. The sound grew marginally louder, closer somehow, though logic told me it had to be coming from the floor above. The building's acoustics were strange down here, sound carrying through ventilation ducts and pipes in ways that defied spatial reasoning. I had learned not to question the phantom footsteps and distant conversations that seemed to emerge from the walls themselves. But then the rhythm changed. The leisurely shuffle became more urgent, the intervals between steps shortening. Someone was walking faster now, their slippers slapping against the floor with increasing tempo. My hands slowed in their folding, unconsciously matching the accelerating cadence above. The sound was getting clearer, more defined, and with growing unease, I realized it wasn't coming from upstairs at all. It was coming from somewhere much closer. I straightened slowly, a half-folded sheet clutched in my trembling fingers. The fluorescent light directly overhead flickered twice, casting my shadow in erratic bursts across the floor. The sound continued to build, the soft rubber scraping now punctuated by the sharp slap of heels striking linoleum with violent force. It was coming from the corridor just beyond the laundry room's open doorway. My throat constricted as I forced myself to listen more carefully. There was something wrong with the pattern, something that made my nervous system recoil even as my rational mind struggled to process what I was hearing. The footsteps were too fast now, inhuman in their speed, a rapid staccato that no person could maintain. And beneath the surface rhythm, I detected an underlying metallic quality, as if the slippers themselves were transforming into something harder, more terrible. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, though the building's heating system continued its steady hum. Goosebumps erupted across my forearms, and I could feel my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs with increasing urgency. Every instinct screamed at me to move, to get away from whatever was creating that sound. But my legs felt rooted to the spot, muscles locked in a paralysis that bordered on complete system failure. The slapping footsteps were coming closer now, their metallic undertone becoming more pronounced with each passing second. They sounded like hammer blows against an anvil, rhythmic and relentless, echoing off the basement walls with a resonance that seemed to vibrate through my bones. My mouth had gone completely dry, tongue sticking to the roof of my mouth as I tried to swallow. The sheet in my hands was damp with perspiration, my palms leaving dark stains on the white cotton. Then, abruptly, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. It pressed against my eardrums like water, heavy and suffocating. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and rapid, and the thunderous beating of my heart seemed loud enough to echo through the entire basement. The fluorescent light continued its intermittent flickering, creating a strobe effect that made everything appear to move in fragmented, jerky motions. I forced my feet to move, one step backward toward the far wall, then another. The sheet fell from my numb fingers and drifted to the floor like a white flag of surrender. My eyes remained fixed on the doorway, watching for any sign of movement in the corridor beyond. The darkness out there seemed absolute, a black void that the weak light from the laundry room couldn't penetrate. Something was out there. I knew it with the same primal certainty that had kept my ancestors alive in primordial forests. Something that had been wearing slippers, moving through the hospital corridors with purpose and malevolent intent. Something that was now standing just beyond the reach of light, waiting. My back pressed against the wall next to the autoclave, the cold steel surface shocking against my skin even through my uniform shirt. The machine's polished exterior reflected the room in warped, funhouse distortions, and as I glanced at it, my blood turned to ice water in my veins. In the curved reflection of the autoclave's surface, I could see the corridor behind me, the one I was facing, stretched and distorted but clearly visible. The doorway was there, the fluorescent light spilling weakly into the hallway beyond. But I wasn't in the reflection. The image showed an empty laundry room, sheets scattered on the floor where I had dropped them, but no sign of my presence whatsoever. And in the reflected corridor, something else was visible. A figure stood motionless in the darkness just beyond the doorway. Its posture was wrong, impossible, spine twisted at angles that would break a human being, limbs bent in directions that defied anatomy. But what made my vision blur with terror was the sight of the name badge pinned to its chest. The same blue and white hospital ID that I wore every day, bearing my photograph and identification number. I spun around, expecting to see the figure behind me, but the corridor was empty. My legs nearly buckled as I turned back to the autoclave's surface, and the reflected image remained unchanged. The twisted form stood there in the reflection, wearing my credentials, existing in a space that my eyes told me was vacant. Panic flooded my system like molten metal, every nerve ending screaming at once. I stumbled away from the wall, my coordination shot, legs weak as water. The fluorescent light above chose that moment to flicker more violently, the room strobing between light and shadow like a nightmare dance floor. In the intermittent darkness, I thought I saw movement in my peripheral vision, shapes that shouldn't exist, shadows that moved independently of their sources. I ran. My feet pounded against the linoleum as I bolted for the corridor, lungs burning as I gasped for air. Behind me, I heard the sound resume. Those terrible metallic impacts, faster now, pursuing. The fluorescent lights in the hallway flickered in sequence as I passed beneath them, as if my presence was triggering some kind of electrical disturbance, or as if something else was following in my wake, leaving darkness behind it. The exit stairs were at the far end of the basement level, past the morgue and through the service corridors that connected the hospital's lower levels. I had walked this route hundreds of times, but now it seemed endless, stretching away from me like a perspective trick in a surreal painting. My ID badge bounced against my chest as I ran, the plastic tag feeling heavier than it should, as if it were trying to drag me down. The metallic footsteps echoed behind me, keeping pace despite my frantic speed. They reverberated off the concrete walls with increasing intensity, creating a cacophony that seemed to come from all directions at once. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw nothing but empty corridor, but the sound continued unabated, growing louder and more violent with each passing second. My lungs were on fire by the time I reached the stairwell, my vision starting to tunnel from lack of oxygen. I grabbed the metal handrail and hauled myself up the concrete steps 3 at a time, the sound of my own footsteps mixing with the phantom pursuit below. The stairwell's emergency lighting cast harsh shadows on the walls, and I could see my own silhouette stretching and contracting as I climbed. At the main floor landing, I fumbled with my key card, hands shaking so violently I could barely swipe it through the reader. The electronic lock beeped twice before finally disengaging, and I burst through the door into the hospital's main corridor. The familiar sounds of the night shift, distant monitors beeping, the soft murmur of nurses' stations, the gentle hum of elevators, washed over me like a blessing. I collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath, my entire body trembling with exhaustion and terror. The normal sounds of the hospital, sounds I had always found somewhat eerie during night shifts, now seemed like a symphony of comfort and sanity. Other people were nearby, living people going about their necessary work, and their presence alone was enough to begin calming my shattered nervous system. But as my breathing started to return to normal, I became aware of something that made my blood pressure spike once again. My ID badge was missing. The lanyard was still around my neck, but the plastic card that bore my photograph and identification was gone. I must have lost it during my frantic escape, though I couldn't remember feeling it tear away. The implications hit me like a physical blow. If something else was wearing my badge, something with my identification, what would happen when security reviewed the cameras? What would they see? A figure moving through the basement levels carrying credentials that proved it belonged there, even if that figure wasn't quite human in its proportions or movements. I spent the rest of my shift on the main floors, helping with patient transport and other duties that kept me around other staff members. I told my supervisor that I had lost my badge and needed a replacement. explaining that the clip must have broken during my work in the laundry. He grumbled about the replacement fee but didn't question the story. But I never went back to the basement levels, not even when explicitly ordered to do so. I found excuses, traded assignments with other workers, even took disciplinary action rather than return to those subterranean corridors. Because sometimes, late at night when the hospital was at its quietest, I would hear the sound drifting up through the ventilation system. The rhythmic metallic impact of something that had once been footsteps, now transformed into a percussion of malevolence that echoed through the building's bones. And I knew that somewhere in those basement corridors, something was still walking, something that wore my face on its credentials, moving through spaces where the living weren't meant to go, serving a purpose I couldn't comprehend but desperately feared I might one day understand. The hospital administration eventually found my original badge during a maintenance inspection of the basement levels. It was discovered pinned to the wall next to the autoclave, at exactly eye level, as if someone had carefully placed it there for display. The plastic was warped and melted around the edges, as though it had been exposed to intense heat, but my photograph was still clearly visible. When they returned it to me, I noticed something that made my hands shake all over again. In the photograph, my eyes seemed to be looking in a slightly different direction than I remembered, and there was an expression on my face that I had never seen in a mirror. A look of recognition, as if I had been seeing something terrible at the moment the picture was taken. I kept the badge, but I never wore it again. Some nights, when sleep eluded me and the world felt particularly thin around the edges, I would take it out and study my own face in that plastic rectangle, wondering what my reflection had witnessed in those basement corridors and whether some part of me was still down there, walking eternally through the darkness in footsteps that had transformed into something that no longer belonged to the world of the living. Story 3. Some places on Earth shouldn't exist. The Black Rock Plateau was one of them, a geological impossibility that defied every textbook I'd ever studied, every principle I'd learned in 20 years of fieldwork. 300 feet of pure obsidian rising from the Nevada desert like a monument to something ancient and wrong. I'd been camped on its summit for 3 days, documenting rock formations that had no business being there. The obsidian showed no signs of volcanic activity, no ash layers, no pyroclastic flows. It simply existed, as if someone had carved it from the Earth's nightmares and left it to bake under the desert sun. The silence up there was absolute. No wind, no insects, no distant highway hum. Just the sound of my own breathing, and the scratch of pencil against paper as I filled my field notebook with measurements that made no sense. That's why the voices hit me like a physical blow. I was hunched over my equipment at 2:47 a.m., adjusting the spectrometer for another mineral analysis, when the first whisper drifted up from the void below. My name. Not Dr. Harrison, not Professor, not even the shortened Jake that everyone used. My full given name, the one buried on birth certificates and forgotten tax forms, the one I'd trained myself never to use. Researcher, oh researcher. The voice was female, melodic, carrying an accent I couldn't place. It seemed to rise from the darkness beyond the plateau's edge, floating up through hundreds of feet of empty air. My hands froze on the equipment. The hair on my neck stood like tiny soldiers at attention. I told myself it was wind through rock formations. Desert acoustics could play tricks. I'd read papers about it. Sound waves bouncing off canyon walls, creating phantom voices. Perfectly rational explanation. But the desert was still, not even a breeze to rustle the sparse vegetation at the plateau's base. Researcher. There it was again, closer this time, as if whoever was calling had somehow ascended through solid rock. My heart hammered against my ribs, sending tremors through my chest that made it hard to breathe. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool night air. I forced myself to stand, legs unsteady beneath me. The LED lantern cast a weak circle of light around my campsite, beyond which lay an ocean of impenetrable darkness. The edge of the plateau was maybe 50 feet away, invisible now, marked only by the absence of stars in that direction. Common sense screamed at me to stay put, to wait for daylight. But 20 years of scientific training demanded investigation. Everything had an explanation. Everything could be understood, cataloged, filed away under the appropriate heading. I grabbed my flashlight, a military-grade beam that could punch through a quarter-mile of darkness, and started toward the plateau's edge. Each step felt like walking through molasses. My breathing came in shallow gasps, my mouth dry as the surrounding desert. The beam swept left and right as I approached the precipice, illuminating nothing but black obsidian and empty space. Far below, the desert floor stretched away into darkness, dotted with the occasional Joshua tree like twisted sentinels. "Researcher, come down to us." The voice was directly below me now. I leaned forward, flashlight beam probing the cliff face. The obsidian was smooth as glass, offering no handholds, no ledges where someone could hide. Yet the voice was unmistakably rising from somewhere down there. My hands shook as I adjusted the flashlight's focus, trying to penetrate deeper into the darkness. The beam caught something, a discoloration in the rock face about 30 feet down. Not natural weathering. Too geometric. Too purposeful. I lay flat on my stomach, inching forward until my head extended past the plateau's edge. The height made my vision blur, my inner ear screaming warnings about the 300-foot drop below. But I could see it now, a section of the cliff face that didn't match the rest. Rectangular, deliberate, like a doorway carved into solid rock. "Come down. We're waiting." The voice seemed to emanate from that opening, impossible as it was. My scientific mind reeled, trying to process what I was seeing. There were no caves and obsidian formations like this, no natural processes that could create such a structure. And even if there were, how could anyone be down there? The cliff was vertical, unclimbable. I scrambled back from the edge, pulse thundering in my ears. My sleeping bag and equipment seemed suddenly fragile, pathetically inadequate protection against whatever was calling to me from that impossible space. The darkness beyond my lantern's reach felt alive, watching, waiting. Sleep was out of the question. I spent the remaining hours until dawn pacing the edges of my campsite, flashlight sweeping constantly across the perimeter. The voices had stopped, but their absence felt worse than their presence. The silence pressed against my eardrums like water pressure, building and building until I wanted to scream just to break it. When the first pale light crept across the eastern horizon, I was already breaking camp. Whatever was down there, whatever geological impossibility I'd stumbled onto, could wait for a larger expedition. Better equipment, more people. But as I rolled up my sleeping bag, something caught my eye. A gleam in the obsidian near the plateau's center, maybe 200 yards from my campsite. I'd surveyed that area yesterday, documented every formation, every interesting feature. There had been nothing there. Against every instinct, I found myself walking toward it. The morning light revealed what my flashlight had missed in the darkness, a fissure in the obsidian, narrow but deep, running maybe 10 feet from north to south. Steam rose from its depths, carrying the sulfur stench of geothermal activity. I knelt beside it, professional curiosity overriding my growing dread. The steam was scorching hot, far hotter than any normal geothermal vent. When I held my hand near the opening, the heat was so intense it felt like standing next to a blast furnace. And there was something else. A sound from deep within the fissure, not the bubble and hiss of boiling water, but something rhythmic. Deliberate, like chanting. I pulled out my phone and activated the flashlight app, angling it down into the crack. The light revealed rough obsidian walls descending beyond the phone's illumination range, but about 20 feet down, the walls changed, became smoother, more regular, artificial. My hands trembled as I adjusted the angle, trying to see deeper. The light caught something carved into the wall, symbols maybe, or letters. I strained my eyes, fighting the steam and heat rising from below. Then I saw it. My name, my full name, the one I'd never told anyone, carved into the obsidian wall in perfect block letters. Dr. Jacob Nathaniel Harrison. Below it, more text, but the steam obscured the details. I jerked back from the fissure so hard I lost my balance, landing hard on the obsidian surface. My phone skittered away across the rock, its light spinning wildly before coming to rest against a small boulder. The rational part of my mind, the part trained in peer review and scientific method, scrambled for explanations. Hallucination brought on by isolation and stress. Pareidolia, the mind's tendency to see patterns where none existed. Sleep deprivation. But the letters had been too clear, too precise. And how could my subconscious create something I'd never seen before? I crawled back to the fissure on hands and knees, ignoring the burns the hot obsidian was leaving on my palms. The steam had intensified, rising in thick columns that made my eyes water. But I could still see the carving, could still make out my name etched into impossible stone. The chanting from below had grown louder, more distinct. Multiple voices now, all female, all calling in that same melodic tone I'd heard in the darkness. They seemed to be speaking in unison, though I couldn't make out individual words through the rising steam. As I watched, horrified and fascinated, water began to seep from the carved letters. Not the clear condensation you'd expect from steam, but something darker, thicker. It ran down the fissure walls in slow rivulets, carrying with it the metallic tang of old blood. The liquid was boiling hot. I could see steam rising from it as it flowed. But it moved with purpose, following channels carved into the rock that I hadn't noticed before. The channels formed patterns, symbols that hurt to look at directly, that seemed to writhe and shift in my peripheral vision. My breathing came in sharp, painful gasps. The air itself felt wrong, too thick, too warm. It tasted of sulfur and something else, something organic and rotten. I wanted to run, wanted to grab my equipment and flee the plateau, but my legs wouldn't respond. I knelt there beside the impossible fissure, watching boiling water trace patterns that predated human civilization. The chanting reached a crescendo, and the flow of liquid increased. It poured from my carved name now, a steady stream of superheated fluid that should have turned to steam instantly in the dry desert air, but instead pooled in the channels below. The pool began to glow with its own light, a sickly phosphorescence that made my skin crawl. And in that glow, I saw something that shattered what remained of my rationality. More names, dozens of them, carved into every surface of the fissure's walls. Dr. Patricia Vance, who disappeared during a survey expedition in Utah 3 years ago. Professor Michael Chen, missing from a dig site in Arizona. Dr. Sarah Whitmore, whose abandoned campsite had been found in the Mojave with no trace of her whereabouts. All geologists, all researchers, all people who'd spent their careers studying the Earth's secrets, all missing. The chanting stopped abruptly, leaving only the hiss and bubble of boiling liquid. In the sudden silence, I heard footsteps, impossible at this height, on this isolated plateau. Slow, deliberate steps approaching from behind. I spun around, still on my knees, expecting to see someone emerging from the empty expanse of obsidian, but there was nothing. Just my abandoned equipment, my hastily rolled sleeping bag, and the vast dome of morning sky. The footsteps continued, circling my position now. I could hear them clearly. The scrape of boot soles against stone, the slight echo that came from walking across hard surfaces. But I saw nothing, no disturbance in the dust, no shadow cast by the rising sun. Panic flooded my system like ice water. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might burst. Sweat poured down my face, mixing with tears I didn't remember shedding. My hands shook uncontrollably as I fumbled for my phone, desperate to call for help, to reach the outside world. No signal. Of course. The plateau was too remote, too isolated. I was alone with whatever was walking circles around me, alone with the impossible fissure and its boiling secrets. The footsteps stopped directly behind me. I could feel presence there, solid and real despite the absence of any visible form. Heat radiated against my back, different from the geothermal warmth rising from the fissure. This was body heat, human warmth. Breath touched the back of my neck, slow, steady exhalations that carried the scent of stone and sulfur. "Welcome, researcher." The voice was behind me, beside me, inside my head. Female, melodic, speaking with perfect diction despite the impossible circumstances. I tried to turn, to see who was speaking, but my body had locked up completely. Every muscle rigid, every nerve screaming. "We've been waiting for you, preparing your place." I forced myself to look down into the fissure. The boiling liquid was rising now, filling the channels carved around my name. The phosphorescent glow pulsed like a heartbeat, and in its rhythm I could hear something that made my blood freeze. My own heartbeat, synchronized perfectly with the pulsing light. The earth keeps its secrets, Jacob, but it also keeps its guardians. And every guardian needs their researcher. Understanding crashed over me like a physical blow. The missing geologists, the carved names, the impossible formation of the plateau itself. This wasn't natural. It was a collection point, a trap designed to lure people like me, people who spent their lives probing the Earth's mysteries. "You can fight if you wish." They all did. But the stone remembers everything, Jacob. Every footstep, every breath, every heartbeat. You're already part of it. I looked down at my hands pressed against the obsidian surface. My palms had left impressions in the rock, not burns from the heat, but actual indentations, as if the stone was softening around my touch. As I watched in horror, the impressions began to deepen, my hands sinking slowly into what should have been solid rock. The logical part of my mind finally shattered completely. I lurched to my feet and ran, abandoning my equipment, my research, everything except the desperate need to escape. Behind me, laughter echoed across the plateau, not cruel but amused, indulgent. I reached the edge where I'd anchored my climbing rope and rappelled down the cliff face without checking my equipment, without ensuring proper safety protocols. The desert floor rushed up to meet me, and I hit the ground running, stumbling through sagebrush and over rock formations. My truck was parked 2 miles away. I made it in 20 minutes, my lungs burning, my legs screaming with exhaustion. The keys slipped from my shaking hands 3 times before I managed to start the engine. As I drove away, I made the mistake of looking back in the rearview mirror. The plateau rose behind me like a black finger pointing at the sky, and on its summit, I could see figures moving, small and distant, but unmistakably human. They stood at the edge, watching my retreat. One of them raised a hand and waved. I drive fast through the desert, radio crackling with static, cell phone dead weight in my pocket. The miles between me and the plateau grow, but the distance feels meaningless. In my mind, I can still hear the chanting, still see my name carved into impossible stone, and somewhere in the depths of my terror, a new understanding takes root. The earth does keep its secrets, but it also marks those who try too hard to uncover them. I've been marked now, and I know with the certainty of stone and sulfur that someday I'll return to the plateau, not by choice but by compulsion, drawn back like iron filings to a magnet, because the stone remembers everything, and it never lets go. Story 4. The fluorescent lights above buzzed with the persistence of dying insects, casting sickly shadows that danced across the yellowed linoleum floor of Sunset Manor's east wing. The smell hit you first, a cocktail of disinfectant, stale urine, and something else, something that reminded me of wet earth after heavy rain. 3 months into this job, and that smell still made my stomach clench every time I walked through those double doors. My name is Marcus, and I work the graveyard shift at what used to be the city's most respected nursing home. Used to be. Now it's where families dump the relatives they can't handle anymore, the ones whose minds have wandered too far into territories that make normal people uncomfortable. The pay is decent enough for someone with my background, which isn't much, and the night shift means fewer supervisors breathing down my neck. But there are things about this place that the day staff doesn't see, things that only emerge when the sun goes down and the building settles into its nocturnal rhythm. The first night I noticed something was wrong. I'd been making my rounds through the East Wing around 2 in the morning. Most residents were deep in medicated sleep, but Mrs. Adelia Santos, room 247, was sitting upright in her bed, her eyes wide open and fixed on the ceiling. Her lips moved constantly, producing sounds that definitely weren't English, Spanish, or Portuguese, despite her Brazilian heritage according to her file. I'd paused outside her door, clipboard in hand, listening to the strange syllables that seemed to roll off her tongue like water over stones. The sounds had a rhythm to them, almost musical, but there was something fundamentally wrong about the melody. It reminded me of those recordings of whale songs played backwards, beautiful yet deeply unsettling. When I'd checked on her the next morning before my shift ended, she was sleeping peacefully, no trace of the nighttime agitation. I'd mentioned it to the day nurse, Sandra, who just shrugged and told me that many dementia patients have disrupted sleep cycles. The medication sometimes caused vivid dreams or hallucinations, but it happened again the next night, and the next. By the end of my first week, I'd started timing Mrs. Adelia's episodes. They began precisely at 1:47 a.m. and lasted exactly 43 minutes. During those periods, she would sit upright, her frail body rigid as a board, and speak in that impossible language. Her voice, normally weak and raspy from age, became strong and clear during these sessions, carrying through the thin walls with an authority that made other residents stir uneasily in their sleep. I started avoiding her room during those times, telling myself it was to respect her privacy, but the truth was simpler and more shameful. The sound of her voice made my skin crawl. There was something primal in my brain that recognized danger in those foreign syllables, even though I couldn't understand why. The building itself seemed to respond to Mrs. Adelia's midnight rituals. During her episodes, the old radiators would begin clanking with unusual intensity, despite the mild October weather. The fluorescent lights would flicker more aggressively, and I'd often hear what sounded like footsteps in the empty corridors, though I was the only staff member on duty. One night, about 3 weeks into the job, I was completing my medication rounds when I heard Mrs. Adelia's voice begin its nightly chant. But this time, something was different. The usual rhythmic quality was gone, replaced by what sounded like urgency, almost desperation. Her voice rose and fell in patterns that made my teeth ache, and I found myself walking toward her room before I'd consciously decided to do so. The hallway leading to room 247 felt longer than usual, stretching ahead of me like a tunnel. The overhead lights flickered more violently with each step I took, creating a strobe effect that made the peeling paint on the walls seem to writhe and shift. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, and I could feel sweat beginning to form along my hairline despite the building's perpetual chill. When I reached her doorway, I stopped. Mrs. Adelia was no longer sitting upright. She was standing beside her bed, her back to me, facing the window that looked out onto the facility's overgrown garden. Her hospital gown hung loose on her skeletal frame, and her white hair, usually pinned back neatly, hung in wild strands around her shoulders. The sounds coming from her throat had changed again. They were lower now, more guttural, and they seemed to be coming from somewhere deeper than her vocal cords should have allowed. The air in the room felt thick, almost viscous, and breathing became an effort that required conscious thought. I should have backed away. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to retreat, to return to the nurse's station and wait for morning. Instead, I stepped into the room. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, Mrs. Adelia's voice stopped. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the chanting had been. She remained motionless for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, then slowly turned to face me. Her eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils. The entire visible portion of her eyes had become a solid reflective black that seemed to absorb the flickering light from the hallway. When she looked at me, I felt something cold and alien brush against my thoughts, like fingers made of ice water probing the inside of my skull. My mouth went dry instantly. My hands began shaking so violently that the clipboard slipped from my grip and clattered to the floor. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the suffocating quiet of the room. Mrs. Adelia tilted her head at an angle that was wrong for human anatomy, nearly 90 degrees to the left, and began walking toward me. Her movements were fluid, predatory, nothing like the shuffling gait I'd observed during my previous encounters with her. Each step seemed to resonate through the floorboards, and I could swear I felt the vibrations traveling up through my legs. I wanted to run. Every cell in my body was screaming for me to flee, but my legs refused to obey. I stood frozen as she approached, watching those impossible black eyes grow larger as the distance between us diminished. My breathing had become rapid and shallow, and I could taste copper in my mouth where I'd bitten my tongue without realizing it. When she was close enough that I could feel the unnatural coldness radiating from her skin, Mrs. Adelia reached out and grasped my wrist with her right hand. Her fingers, which I'd previously thought looked fragile and brittle, clamped down with crushing force. I could feel my bones grinding together under the pressure, and a sound escaped my throat that was part gasp, part whimper. The moment her skin made contact with mine, the room around us began to change. The familiar beige walls started to darken, not from shadows, but from something that seemed to be seeping through the paint itself. The darkness spread outward from where we stood, creeping along the surfaces like spilled ink. But it was the floor that truly terrified me. Beneath our feet, the old hardwood began to emit sounds I'd never heard before. Deep, resonant groaning that seemed to come from the very core of the building. The boards started to warp and buckle, and then I saw them. Long, deep gouges appearing in the wood around us. They looked like claw marks. The scratches carved themselves into the floor in real time, invisible talons dragging through the timber with enough force to send splinters flying. The gouges formed a perfect circle around Mrs. Adelia and me, each mark precisely spaced and uniformly deep. The sound of wood being torn apart filled the air, combining with Mrs. Adelia's resumed chanting to create a symphony of wrongness that made my entire body vibrate with terror. I tried to pull away from her grip, but she held me fast. Her black eyes never left mine, and I could see something moving behind them, shapes that suggested intelligence, but not humanity. The cold that emanated from her touch was spreading up my arm, numbing my shoulder and beginning to creep toward my chest. The circle of claw marks was nearly complete now. As the invisible talons carved the final scratches into the hardwood, connecting the pattern, I felt the air pressure in the room change dramatically. My ears popped, and for a moment, I couldn't hear anything except the thunderous beating of my own heart. Then Mrs. Adelia spoke, and for the first time since I'd known her, I understood the words. She told me things about myself that no one else knew. Secrets I'd buried, mistakes I'd made, fears I'd never voiced to another living soul. But she didn't just know these things. She knew what they meant, how they connected to form the pattern of my life, and most terrifyingly, what they would lead to if left unchanged. The knowledge she shared wasn't delivered with words exactly. It was downloaded directly into my consciousness, bypassing my ears entirely. I understood that Mrs. Adelia, or whatever was speaking through her, had been watching me since the moment I'd started working at Sunset Manor. It had been evaluating me, measuring my worthiness for something I couldn't quite grasp. As this impossible revelation settled into my brain like acid, the scratches in the floor began to glow with a faint greenish light. The illumination pulsed in rhythm with Mrs. Adelia's words, and I realized that the circle wasn't just decorative. It was functional. It was a boundary, a marker, a trap. The cold from her touch had spread to my chest now, and my breathing was becoming labored. Ice crystals were forming on my skin where she held me, and I could see my breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the mental assault I was experiencing. Images flooded my mind, visions of Sunset Manor's history that went back decades. I saw previous night shift workers, men and women like myself who had encountered Mrs. Adelia during her nocturnal episodes. I watched them face the same choice I was now confronting, and I witnessed the consequences of their decisions. Some had fled, leaving their jobs and never returning. They carried the memory of this encounter with them forever, never quite able to forget or explain what they'd experienced. Others had stayed, accepting the knowledge they'd been given and allowing themselves to be changed by it. Mrs. Adelia released my wrist. The sudden absence of her touch was like being dropped into warm water after spending hours in a freezer. Sensation flooded back into my arm, accompanied by pins and needles so intense they brought tears to my eyes. I staggered backward, finally able to move again, but found myself still trapped within the circle of glowing scratches. The black had faded from Mrs. Adelia's eyes, replaced by their normal pale blue. She looked at me with an expression that was entirely lucid, entirely human, and somehow more frightening than the alien intelligence that had possessed her moments before. She smiled, and in that smile, I saw acknowledgement. She knew that I knew. The charade was over. Without speaking, she walked back to her bed and settled under the covers. Within moments, she appeared to be sleeping peacefully, just another elderly resident of Sunset Manor getting her rest. But I could feel her awareness like a weight on my shoulders, a constant reminder that I was being observed and evaluated. The scratches in the floor remained, though their glow had faded to barely perceptible. In daylight, they would look like ordinary wear and tear, the kind of damage you'd expect in a building this age. But I would always know what they really were. A mark, a sign, a warning. I completed my rounds that night in a state of numb shock. My hands shook as I checked on other residents, recorded vital signs, and dispensed medication. Every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes. Every creak of the old building sounded like whispered threats. When my shift ended at 7 a.m., I walked to my car in a daze. The morning sun felt impossibly bright after the events of the night, and the normal sounds of traffic and birds seemed to come from another world entirely. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, staring at Sunset Manor's facade and trying to process what had happened. I could quit. I could drive away and never return, find another job, another life. But I knew that wouldn't really solve anything. The knowledge Mrs. Adelia had shared with me couldn't be unlearned, and the choice she'd presented couldn't be avoided forever. That evening, I returned to work. Mrs. Adelia was waiting for me in the hallway outside room 247, fully dressed and carrying a small suitcase. She nodded at me politely, as if we were old acquaintances meeting by chance, and informed me that her family was picking her up in the morning. Her stay at Sunset Manor was ending, but before she left, she had something to give me. From her suitcase, she withdrew a worn leather journal filled with handwritten notes in dozens of different languages. Some I recognized, others were completely foreign, and a few seemed to be written in symbols that hurt to look at directly. She pressed the book into my hands and told me that it would help me understand my new responsibilities. The journal was warm to the touch, and I could swear I felt it pulse like a heartbeat against my palms. Mrs. Adelia returned to her room, and I never saw her again. The next morning, I learned that no family had come to pick her up. According to the day staff, she had simply vanished sometime during the night, leaving behind only her hospital gown and a room that smelled faintly of wet earth. Her official discharge papers were in perfect order, signed by doctors who claimed to have no memory of treating her. Her medical records showed a stay of exactly 1 month, though I knew she'd been there for at least 6 weeks when I started. The journal remains in my possession. I've read portions of it, enough to understand that Sunset Manor is not what it appears to be. Some buildings are more than simple structures. They're anchors, holding certain things in place that might otherwise drift into spaces where they don't belong. The facility needs a guardian, someone to monitor the boundaries and ensure that the crossing points remain stable. That someone is now me. I still work the night shift, making my rounds and checking on residents. But my real job begins at 1:47 a.m., when the walls grow thin and other things begin to stir. The journal has taught me what to watch for, what to allow, and what must be stopped before it fully manifests. Mrs. Adelia wasn't the first resident to serve as a conduit, and she won't be the last. They come and go, these special patients, drawn to Sunset Manor by forces they don't understand. Some are aware of their role, others are simply vessels for intelligences that speak through their dreams. My hands no longer shake when I hear impossible languages echoing through the corridors. My heart rate stays steady when shadows move independently of their sources. The cold touch of otherworldly attention has become as familiar as my own reflection. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I wonder what I've become. The knowledge Mrs. Adelia shared has grown inside me like a living thing, changing the way I perceive reality itself. I see patterns that others miss, understand connections that shouldn't exist, and feel the constant presence of watchers from spaces beyond normal perception. The scratches in room 247's floor have been covered by new flooring, but I know they're still there underneath, waiting for the next guardian to need them. And when that time comes, when someone new arrives to take my place, I'll be ready to pass along what I've learned. Until then, I wait and I watch, and I make sure that the things that speak through sleeping minds stay exactly where they belong, trapped between worlds, contained within the crumbling walls of Sunset Manor, held in check by the will of those foolish enough to accept the burden of keeping them there. The fluorescent lights still buzz overhead, casting their sickly shadows across yellowed linoleum. The smell of disinfectant and wet earth still fills my nostrils with each breath. But now I understand that these aren't simply signs of decay and institutional neglect. They're symptoms of something much larger, much older, and infinitely more dangerous than a failing nursing home. And I'm the only thing standing between that something and the unsuspecting world beyond these walls. Story 5. The house breathes at night, and I've learned to count its rhythms. Each creak of settling wood, each whisper of wind through gaps I can never quite locate, each subtle shift in the darkness that pools in corners where my lights refuse to reach. But tonight, there's something else breathing down there in the basement, and it's keeping time with my own terrified heartbeat. I inherited this 3-story Victorian from my grandmother 3 months ago, along with her debts and her stories about things that shouldn't exist. The realtor had called it a charming fixer-upper with original character, which I now understand to be code for haunted money pit with a basement that feels like a throat waiting to swallow you whole. But the price was right, and after my divorce I needed somewhere to disappear for a while. I just hadn't expected something to be waiting for me when I got here. The first week was normal enough. I spent my days ripping up moldy carpet and scraping decades of paint from window frames, falling into bed each night too exhausted to notice the house's peculiarities. It was only after I'd settled into a routine that I began to feel the weight of being watched. The sensation started as a mild discomfort, like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit, but it grew stronger each day until I found myself checking locks obsessively and avoiding certain rooms after dark. The basement had been the worst from the beginning. It stretched the full length of the house, divided into several rooms by crude wooden partitions that looked like they'd been added as afterthoughts. The ceiling was low enough that I had to duck in places, and the concrete floor was stained with substances I preferred not to identify. The single bulb that hung from a frayed cord cast harsh shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source, and the air down there always tasted metallic, like sucking on old pennies. My grandmother had used it for storage, filling it with boxes of photographs, old furniture, and the accumulated detritus of 8 decades of life. I'd been meaning to sort through it all, but something about the space made my skin crawl. Every time I descended those creaking wooden stairs, my body would tense with primitive alarm, my breathing would shallow, and my hands would develop a fine tremor that I couldn't quite control. It was as if some ancient part of my brain recognized danger that my conscious mind couldn't process. After 2 weeks of increasing unease, I'd finally broken down and installed a security system. Nothing fancy, just motion sensors connected to an app on my phone, with a small camera in each major room. I told myself it was practical, a way to monitor the house when I was at work. But truthfully, I needed proof that I wasn't losing my mind. The feeling of being observed had become so intense that I'd started talking to myself just to break the oppressive silence. And I'd caught myself checking over my shoulder so frequently that my neck had developed a permanent ache. The first sensor to trigger had been in the living room on a Tuesday night. My phone had buzzed at 2:17 a.m., jolting me from uneasy sleep with its harsh notification tone. The app showed movement detected, but when I pulled up the camera feed, I saw nothing but my empty living room bathed in the pale glow of streetlights filtering through gauze curtains. I'd stared at the screen for 10 minutes, my heart hammering against my ribs, before convincing myself it had been a false alarm. Maybe a mouse, or the house settling, or the sensor's sensitivity set too high. The second trigger had come from the kitchen the following night, again in the early morning hours when sleep was lightest and shadows held the most power. This time I'd crept downstairs with a baseball bat clutched in sweating palms, every board groaning under my feet like a betrayal. But the kitchen had been empty, everything exactly as I'd left it. The coffee maker blinked its green light, the refrigerator hummed its mechanical lullaby, and my breakfast dishes sat clean in the drying rack. Nothing disturbed, nothing out of place, nothing to explain the icy certainty that something had been there moments before. By the third false alarm, my nerves were frayed to the point where I'd started jumping at my own shadow. Sleep had become elusive, coming in fitful fragments between hours of lying rigid in bed, straining to hear sounds that might not exist. I'd begun to question the reliability of the sensors, wondering if I'd bought cheap equipment that couldn't distinguish between genuine intruders and random environmental fluctuations. But then came the first basement alarm. The notification had pierced the 3 a.m. silence like a digital scream, and I'd bolted upright with such violence that I'd nearly fallen out of bed. My phone screen blazed in the darkness, showing movement detected in the basement storage room. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely navigate to the camera feed, my heart rate spiking to a pace that made my vision blur at the edges. The basement camera showed only darkness, not the normal darkness of a room without lights, but an absolute black void that seemed to absorb the camera's infrared illumination. I could see the concrete floor near the stairs, the bottom edges of some storage boxes, but beyond that, nothing. Just an impenetrable wall of shadow that the camera couldn't penetrate. And then I heard it through the phone speaker, a sound that made every muscle in my body lock tight with primal terror. Breathing, deep, deliberate respirations that came with mechanical regularity, each exhale lasting exactly 3 seconds, each inhale taking 2. The sound was too clear, too close to the microphone, as if whatever was breathing was standing directly next to the camera. I'd listened for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. My own breath held until my lungs burned, afraid that any sound I made might alert whatever was down there to my presence upstairs. The breathing continued without variation, neither speeding up nor slowing down, as steady and inevitable as a metronome. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound itself. Sleep had been impossible after that. I'd spent the rest of the night sitting in my bedroom with the baseball bat across my knees, checking the camera feed every few minutes. The basement remained empty, or at least appeared to, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still down there, waiting in the spaces the camera couldn't see. The second basement alarm had come the following night, at exactly 3:17 a.m. Again, the camera showed only that strange, light-absorbing darkness, and again came the sound of breathing, that same measured pattern that seemed to mock the rapid, panicked rhythm of my own respirations. This time I'd noticed something else, a faint scratching sound underneath the breathing, like fingernails dragging across concrete or metal scraping against stone. I'd grabbed my phone and called the police, my voice cracking as I tried to explain the situation to a dispatcher who clearly thought I was either drunk or having a breakdown. They'd promised to send a unit to check the perimeter, but by the time the officers arrived 20 minutes later, the basement had gone silent. The responding officers had been professional but skeptical, their flashlight beams cutting through the basement gloom as they conducted a perfunctory search. They'd found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of an intruder, no explanation for the sounds I'd heard. One of the officers, a tired-looking woman with gray streaking her temples, had suggested that old houses often had issues with settling foundations and small animals. She'd advised me to have the sensors checked by a technician and maybe consider getting a cat to deal with any mice that might be triggering false alarms. Her partner had been less diplomatic, his expression suggesting he thought I was wasting their time with paranoid delusions. After they left, I'd forced myself to go down to the basement with a powerful flashlight, determined to find some rational explanation for what was happening. The concrete floor was dusty and undisturbed, the storage boxes exactly where I'd left them. But when I'd examined the motion sensor mounted on the wall near the camera, my blood had turned to ice water in my veins. The device was bent, not damaged or broken, but deliberately manipulated, The plastic housing curved inward as if invisible hands had tried to reshape it. The sensor's detection field, which should have been pointing outward to monitor the room, had been redirected to aim at the camera itself. It was as if something had been trying to look inside the device, to understand how it worked or what it was watching. My hands had trembled so violently as I straightened the sensor that I'd nearly dropped the flashlight. The plastic housing was warm to the touch despite the basement's perpetual chill, and when I'd pulled my fingers away, they'd felt sticky, as if the device had been coated with some kind of residue I couldn't identify. The third night had been the worst. I'd barely managed to fall asleep when the alarm jolted me awake at 3:27 a.m., 10 minutes later than the previous nights, as if whatever was down there was deliberately varying its schedule to keep me off balance. This time, along with the breathing and scratching, I'd heard something new. A low humming sound, almost below the threshold of hearing, that seemed to vibrate through the house's wooden frame. The camera feed had shown the same impenetrable darkness, but now I could see movement within it. Not clear shapes, but suggestions of motion, like shadows moving behind black curtains. The breathing had grown louder, more urgent, and underneath it came a new sound that made my stomach clench with revulsion. Wet, sliding noises, as if something was dragging itself across the damp concrete. I'd grabbed the gun I'd purchased after the second incident, a small pistol that felt inadequate in my shaking hands, and crept downstairs. Each step had felt like a betrayal, my body screaming at me to run while my mind insisted I needed answers. The basement door had been standing slightly ajar, though I was certain I'd left it closed, and cool air had flowed up from below, carrying with it a smell that reminded me of copper and decay. The wooden stairs had groaned under my weight as I descended, my flashlight beam dancing wildly as my hands shook. The basement had appeared empty, just storage boxes and shadows, but the motion sensor had been bent again, this time almost double, as if something had been trying to fold it in half. The metal housing had been warm enough to feel through my palm when I'd touched it, and the surface had been slick with moisture that definitely hadn't been there before. But it was what I'd found next to the sensor that had nearly sent me fleeing back upstairs in panic. Scratched into the concrete wall were marks that looked almost like letters, crude symbols gouged deep enough to leave pale concrete dust scattered on the floor below. The scratches were fresh. I would have noticed them during my previous inspections, and they formed a pattern that seemed familiar, but refused to resolve into anything I could understand. The breathing had stopped the moment my foot hit the basement floor, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums. But I'd felt watched, observed with an intensity that made my skin crawl and my scalp prickle with electric awareness. Something had been down there with me, something that was now perfectly still, perfectly quiet, waiting to see what I would do. I'd spent less than 5 minutes in the basement that third night, but it had felt like hours. Every shadow had seemed to pulse with potential movement. Every sound of the old house settling had made me spin toward empty corners with my gun raised. When I'd finally retreated upstairs, I'd locked the basement door and shoved a chair under the handle, as if thin wood and cheap hardware could keep out whatever was claiming territory in the space below. The fourth night, I'd made a decision that I knew was either brilliant or completely insane. I was going to stay awake and wait. I'd positioned myself in the kitchen with a clear view of the basement door, my gun within easy reach, and my phone set to record everything. If something was living in my basement, if some intruder had found a way in that I couldn't detect, I was going to catch them in the act. The hours had crawled by with agonizing slowness. I'd drunk enough coffee to make my hands shake independently of fear, and I'd checked the basement camera feed so many times that my phone's battery had begun to drain. But as 3 a.m. approached, my nerves had stretched to their breaking point. The house had seemed to grow more oppressive with each passing minute, the shadows deeper, the silence more pregnant with unspoken threats. At 3:37 a.m., the alarm had sounded. This time I'd been ready. I'd switched to the camera feed immediately, my heart pounding, but my mind sharp with caffeine and adrenaline. The basement had appeared empty as always, shrouded in that same light-swallowing darkness. But I'd been watching when the breathing started, and this time, I'd seen something that made my blood freeze in my veins. The darkness had been moving. Not the random shifts of shadow and light that I'd noticed before, but deliberate, purposeful movement, as if the absence of light itself was alive and aware. The breathing had started soft but had grown louder with each cycle, and underneath it came new sounds. Wet, organic noises that spoke of things that shouldn't exist, dragging themselves across concrete. But it was when I'd seen the sensor begin to bend that I'd known I was dealing with something beyond my understanding. The device had curved inward as I watched, the plastic housing reshaping itself as if invisible hands were molding it like clay. The motion had been slow, deliberate, almost sensual in its precision, and when it was finished, the sensor had been pointed directly at the camera, directly at me. That's when I'd heard my own breathing coming through the phone's speaker. Not the mechanical, measured breathing that had terrified me for 3 nights, but my own rapid, panicked respirations, transmitted somehow from my position in the kitchen down to the basement and back through the camera's microphone. It was impossible, technically improbable, but I'd been listening to myself breathe through a speaker while sitting 30 feet above the device that was capturing the sound. The realization had hit me like a physical blow. Whatever was in my basement wasn't just aware of the cameras and sensors. It was using them. It had learned to manipulate the devices, to bend them to its will, to turn my own security system into a window that looked both ways. I hadn't been monitoring an intruder. I'd been observed, studied, cataloged by something that understood technology better than I did. I'd run then, abandoning my post in the kitchen and fleeing to my bedroom like a child afraid of monsters in the dark. But even behind a locked door, I'd felt exposed, vulnerable, watched by eyes I couldn't see through cameras I'd installed to make myself feel safe. The basement alarm had continued to sound for another 10 minutes before falling silent, leaving me alone with the terrible knowledge that I was no longer the sole occupant of my grandmother's house. Now, as I sit here in the pre-dawn darkness of the 5th night, I've finally understood what my grandmother's stories had been trying to tell me. This house isn't haunted in any conventional sense. It's inhabited by something that exists in the spaces between reality and technology, something that feeds on observation and grows stronger with each electronic eye we give it to see through. The scratches on the basement wall aren't random marks. They're a signature, a claim of ownership written in a language that predates human speech. The bent sensors aren't damaged. They're improved, modified by intelligence that sees our attempts at security as invitations to play a game we don't understand. And the breathing I've been hearing isn't the sound of some physical intruder hiding in my basement. It's the rhythm of something vast and patient, slowly synchronizing itself with my own life force, learning to match my patterns, to mirror my existence until the boundary between observer and observed disappears entirely. My phone buzzes in my hand. 3:47 a.m. Motion detected in the basement. This time I'm not going down there. This time I'm leaving the house to whatever has claimed it, taking nothing but my keys and the terrible knowledge that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The breathing has already started, coming through my phone's speaker with mechanical precision. But now, underneath it, I can hear something new. The sound of footsteps on wooden stairs, slow and deliberate, climbing toward the main floor. Climbing toward me. I think it's finally ready to meet its new housemate face to face. Story 6. The headlights cut through the darkness like twin knives, illuminating nothing but endless asphalt and the skeletal remains of trees that lined the forgotten highway. Something was wrong with this road. Had been wrong since I'd turned onto it 3 hours ago, though it should have taken me home in 40 minutes. The day had started normal enough. 6 hours on Lake Morrison with my tackle box and a cooler full of beer, catching nothing but sunburn and the kind of peace that only comes from sitting in silence while the world spins without you. The bass weren't biting, but I didn't care. After the week I'd had, the promotion that went to someone else, Sarah's lawyer calling about the divorce papers, my father's diagnosis, I needed the emptiness. Now, driving home in my rusted pickup, that emptiness felt different, heavier, like it was pressing down on my chest, making each breath a conscious effort. The radio had been playing classic rock when I first got on Highway 49, some Eagles tune that reminded me of better times. But somewhere around mile marker 23, it had dissolved into static, a harsh white noise that seemed to pulse with my heartbeat. I'd tried every station, spinning the dial until my fingers were slick with sweat, but found nothing except that relentless hiss. I reached for the power button, but my hand froze midway. Something about the silence felt worse than the static. At least the noise meant the radio was working, that electricity still flowed through the truck's ancient veins. Silence might mean something had died. The GPS screen glowed sickly green in the darkness, its arrow spinning in lazy circles like a compass near a magnet. The estimated arrival time kept changing, sometimes showing 2 hours, sometimes 6, once blinking 0 hour before resuming its senseless rotation. The map displayed nothing but a gray void with a single road cutting through it, as if the world beyond this highway had simply ceased to exist. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles white against the cracked leather. The speedometer needle hovered at 55, steady as a metronome, but something felt off about the rhythm of the engine, about the way the yellow lines disappeared beneath my wheels. That's when I saw it the first time. The broken post stood maybe 20 feet off the right shoulder, tilted at a 45-degree angle like it was bowing to something unseen. What remained of a stop sign clung to its top. The red octagon twisted and faded, its message illegible in the darkness. Fragments of reflective tape caught my headlights, winking like dead eyes. I'd noticed it peripherally, the way you notice roadkill or abandoned furniture, just another piece of rural decay. But as I rounded the next curve, my foot eased off the accelerator. There it was again. Same post, same angle, same rusted stop sign hanging like a broken wing. My stomach clenched, acid rising in my throat. I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere, doubled back without realizing it. These backwoods roads all looked the same in the dark. Endless ribbons of cracked asphalt threading through forests that seemed to breathe in the shadows. But I hadn't turned. I'd been driving straight for the last hour, following the GPS's mindless spinning arrow because it was the only movement in this static world. The road curved again, a gentle bend to the left that my headlights swept across like searchlights hunting for survivors. Trees lined both sides, their branches forming a tunnel of darkness overhead. No streetlights, no house lights, no sign of human habitation, except this ribbon of asphalt and the broken post that now appeared for the third time. My pulse hammered against my temples. The air in the cab felt thick, oppressive, like breathing through wet wool. I rolled down the window, desperate for fresh air, but what rushed in carried no relief, just the smell of decay and something else, something organic and wrong. The speedometer still read 55, but the world outside seemed to be moving slower, like I was driving through syrup. The yellow lines beneath my wheels pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat, hypnotic and nauseating. Fourth time, fifth, sixth. Each appearance of the broken post sent fresh waves of panic through my nervous system. My shirt clung to my back, soaked with cold sweat. My mouth felt like I'd been chewing cotton, tongue thick and useless. The steering wheel grew slippery in my palms, and I had to wipe them repeatedly on my jeans. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe there were multiple broken posts along this route, abandoned road maintenance, rural decay spreading like cancer through forgotten corners of the state. Maybe my exhaustion was making me paranoid, seeing patterns where none existed. But I knew that post, knew the exact angle of its lean, the specific pattern of rust that bloomed across its surface like some terrible flower. Knew the way the twisted stop sign caught my headlights, throwing back fragments of red that looked like blood in the darkness. On the 7th pass, I pulled over. The truck's engine ticked in the sudden silence, metal cooling and contracting with small, sharp sounds like bones breaking. I sat there, hands trembling on the wheel, trying to make sense of what was happening. The static from the radio had grown louder, more insistent, as if it were trying to communicate something I couldn't understand. I needed proof, something concrete to hold on to before my sanity slipped completely away. Fumbling in the darkness, I found my phone and aimed its camera at the broken post. The flash exploded across the scene, freezing it in harsh white light for one terrible instant. In the photo, the post looked different somehow. More real, more present, as if it had been waiting for me to acknowledge it. But when I looked at the image on my screen, my breath caught in my throat. The timestamp read 3:47 a.m., but it had been barely past 10 when I'd left the lake. Time was slipping away from me like water through cupped hands. I put the truck back in drive and continued forward, but now I was watching the odometer obsessively. 0.1 miles, 0.2, 0.3. The curve was approaching again, that gentle bend to the left that would reveal what I already knew was waiting. 0.7 miles, and there it was. The broken post, exactly as before, as if I'd traveled in a perfect circle despite driving straight. My hands were shaking so violently now that I could barely maintain control of the steering wheel. The truck wavered between the yellow lines, threatening to drift into the drainage ditch that bordered the road. I pressed the brake pedal, feeling it sink toward the floor with a squishy resistance that sent fresh terror shooting through my nervous system. The brakes were failing. Or maybe they'd been failing all along, and I'd been trapped in this loop because I literally couldn't stop. The thought brought a bubble of hysterical laughter up from my chest, sharp and bitter as bile. That's when I remembered the glove compartment. I'd been meaning to clean it out for months. Old registration papers, a broken flashlight, expired insurance cards. But as my fingers found the handle and pulled it open, revealing the cluttered interior, my eyes fixed on something that shouldn't have been there. A folded piece of paper, white against the accumulated debris. Clean as if it had been placed there moments ago, my hand shook as I unfolded it, revealing handwriting in blue ballpoint pen. Neat, careful letters that seemed to pulse in the glow from the dashboard lights. You still haven't passed me. The paper slipped from my nerveless fingers and fluttered to the floor. The world tilted, gravity shifting sideways as vertigo swept through me. This wasn't possible. No one had access to my truck. It had been locked in the parking lot at the lake all day, and I'd had the keys with me the entire time. Unless someone had been waiting, watching, following. The thought sent ice water through my veins. I jerked my head around, checking the rearview mirror, the side mirrors, craning my neck to peer into the darkness behind me. Nothing. Just the red glow of my taillights stretching back into empty night. But the note meant someone knew where I was. Someone who understood what was happening to me better than I did. The broken post appeared again, and this time I was ready for it. I slammed on the brakes, feeling the pedal sink uselessly toward the floor as the truck continued its steady 55 mph crawl through the darkness. The ABS system didn't even engage. Just that soft, spongy resistance, as if the brake lines had been cut, or as if physics had simply stopped applying to my situation. I tried the emergency brake, yanking the handle with desperate strength. Nothing. The truck maintained its steady pace, carrying me forward toward whatever was waiting in the curve ahead. The radio static intensified, rising to a shriek that seemed to originate from inside my skull. I clapped my hands over my ears, but the sound followed me there, growing louder and more insistent until I thought my eardrums might burst. Through the static, I began to hear something else. Voices, distant and distorted, speaking words I couldn't quite make out. They seemed to be calling my name, but the syllables were wrong, stretched and twisted until they sounded like accusations rather than identification. The GPS screen flickered, and for a moment the gray void was replaced by something else. A satellite view of the highway, but wrong somehow. The road curved in on itself, forming a perfect circle with the broken post at its center. As I watched, a tiny blue dot that represented my truck traced the same path over and over, never deviating, never stopping. I was trapped in a loop, driving the same stretch of road endlessly, while something watched from the broken post. The realization hit me like a physical blow, doubling me over the steering wheel as nausea rolled through my stomach. My vision blurred, black spots dancing at the edges as hyperventilation set in. The air in the cab felt too thin, too hot, despite the cool night breeze flowing through the open window. I forced myself to breathe slowly, deeply, fighting the panic that threatened to consume what remained of my rational mind. There had to be an explanation. a logical reason for what was happening. But as the broken post appeared for what must have been the 20th time, I knew that logic had abandoned me completely. The note was still there on the floor, a white rectangle of accusation in the darkness. I retrieved it with trembling fingers and read it again, searching for clues in the handwriting, in the choice of words. You still haven't passed me, not by me or through me, but past me. As if the act of moving beyond the post required something more than simple forward motion. I thought about the days fishing, about the emptiness I'd sought and found, about the divorce papers and the promotion and my father's cancer, all the failures and disappointments that had driven me to the lake in search of peace. Maybe I wasn't supposed to be running away. Maybe the post was a checkpoint, a test I kept failing by trying to drive past it instead of confronting whatever it represented. The idea terrified me more than the supernatural aspects of my situation. I'd spent my entire adult life running from difficult conversations, uncomfortable truths, responsibilities I didn't want to face. The pattern had cost me my marriage, my career advancement, and now possibly my relationship with my dying father. The broken post appeared again, and this time I didn't try to brake. Instead, I pulled over directly beside it. The truck shuddered to a stop, engine finally falling silent. The sudden absence of mechanical noise was deafening, leaving only the static from the radio and the sound of my own ragged breathing. Up close, the post looked even more wrong than it had from the road. The metal was corroded in patterns that seemed deliberately artistic, forming shapes that hurt to look at directly. The stop sign hanging from its top wasn't just faded, it was covered in text that hadn't been there before, words written in the same neat handwriting as the note in my glove compartment. I couldn't read them from inside the truck, but I knew I needed to get closer, needed to face whatever message was waiting for me. My hand hesitated on the door handle. Once I stepped outside, there would be no pretending this was just fatigue or stress or some kind of hallucination. Whatever was happening here would become real in a way that terrified me. But staying in the truck meant driving the same loop forever, trapped in my own inability to move forward. I opened the door. The night air hit me like a slap, carrying scents of pine and decay and something else. Something that reminded me of hospitals and endings. My legs felt weak as I approached the post, each step requiring conscious effort. The words on the stop sign became clear as I drew near. Stop running. Face what you've left behind. The road home is shorter than you think. My knees buckled, and I found myself kneeling in the gravel beside the broken post, tears streaming down my face. The message wasn't supernatural at all. It was simple, human truth dressed up in my own guilt and fear. I'd been running from my father's diagnosis, avoiding the phone calls and doctor visits and difficult conversations about time and forgiveness. I'd been running from the divorce papers sitting unsigned on my kitchen table, too proud to admit that Sarah had been right about my inability to commit to anything difficult. I'd been running from the promotion I'd lost because I'd been too afraid to fight for it, too comfortable with mediocrity to risk failure. The broken post wasn't trapping me in a loop. I was trapping myself, circling endlessly around my own cowardice. As understanding flooded through me, the static from the radio faded to silence. The GPS screen flickered once and displayed a clear route home, a simple straight line that would take 40 minutes, just as it should have. I climbed back into the truck, started the engine, and drove forward. The road stretched ahead of me, normal and welcoming, leading toward lights in the distance that marked the edge of town. In my rearview mirror, the broken post grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely, taking with it the supernatural weight that had pressed down on my chest. But the note remained on my floor, and the memory of those words would stay with me long after I reached home. Long after I made the phone calls I'd been avoiding and signed the papers I'd been dreading and had the conversations that would change everything. Some loops we create ourselves, and the only way out is through the truth we've been too afraid to face. The headlights swept across familiar landmarks as I drove toward home, toward the responsibilities and relationships I'd spent too long avoiding. Behind me, the highway returned to ordinary darkness, empty of broken posts and supernatural warnings. But I would never forget the feeling of being trapped by my own fear, or the relief of finally choosing to move forward instead of running in circles. The radio crackled back to life, playing a song I remembered from better times. A reminder that some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed impossible to win. Story 7. The fluorescent lights in Ward 7 flickered with that familiar dying wheeze, casting intermittent shadows that danced across the linoleum like restless spirits. The night shift at Millbrook Psychiatric Facility had always been a descent into an unsettling quiet, but tonight felt different, heavier, as if the very air had thickened with something unspoken. I adjusted my collar against the perpetual chill that seemed to seep from the walls themselves, my footsteps echoing down the corridor with metronomic precision. 23 years I'd been making these rounds, checking on the patients who couldn't sleep, ensuring the locked doors remained locked, maintaining the fragile barrier between order and chaos. 23 years, and I'd never felt the building watching me back. The institutional green paint peeled in long strips near the baseboards, revealing patches of decay that resembled skin sloughing off bone. My flashlight beam swept across each doorway, illuminating the small observation windows that glowed like vacant eyes. Room 714 housed Mrs. Patterson, who whispered to invisible companions until dawn. Room 716 contained Marcus Webb, who hadn't spoken since his admission 3 months ago, but spent his nights arranging and rearranging his bed sheets into precise geometric patterns. Then there was Room 718, the isolation room. Dr. Chen had transferred the new patient there yesterday afternoon, a middle-aged man named Vincent Delacroix, who'd been found wandering downtown in a catatonic state. No identification, no family, no past that anyone could verify. He'd remained motionless since admission, lying flat on his back with his eyes fixed on the ceiling, unresponsive to stimuli, yet somehow radiating an intensity that made even the day staff uncomfortable. As I approached his door, my pulse quickened for reasons I couldn't articulate. The observation window revealed only darkness beyond. The room's interior light had burned out that morning, and maintenance hadn't gotten around to replacing it. Through the thick glass, I could barely make out the shape of the bed and what might have been a human form beneath the white institutional blanket. That's when I heard it. The sound of splintering wood echoed from inside room 718, sharp and violent in the corridor's oppressive silence. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pressed my face to the observation window, trying to peer through the gloom. The sound came again, the unmistakable crack of furniture breaking, followed by a heavy thud that vibrated through the wall. My hands trembled as I fumbled for the master key, sweat forming beneath my uniform despite the corridor's chill. The lock turned with a metallic click that seemed to reverberate through my bones. I pushed the door open, flashlight raised, and stepped into the darkness. The beam illuminated chaos. The massive wardrobe that had stood against the far wall, a heavy oak monstrosity that predated the facility's modern furnishings, lay toppled on its side near the center of the room. Its dark wood surface was cracked and splintered, as if something had torn it apart from within. Drawers had been pulled free and scattered across the floor, their contents spilled in angry heaps. But Vincent Delacroix remained exactly as I'd last seen him, motionless in his bed, the restraints still secure around his wrists and ankles, his vacant stare fixed on the water-stained ceiling tiles. There was no way, absolutely no way, he could have moved that wardrobe. The thing had to weigh 300 pounds, and even if he'd somehow freed himself from the restraints, the distance from the bed to where the furniture now lay was impossible to cover. I moved closer to examine the wreckage, my flashlight beam dancing over the destroyed wood. That's when I noticed the largest drawer lying upside down near my feet. Instead of the expected linens or patient belongings, its interior revealed something that made my breath catch in my throat. Photographs. Polaroids, to be exact. Dozens of them, scattered across the drawer's bottom like fallen leaves. I knelt down, my hands shaking as I picked up the first one. The image that stared back at me froze the blood in my veins. It was me. The photograph showed me standing in the corridor outside this very room, taken from an angle that suggested the photographer had been positioned somewhere behind the nurse's station. The timestamp in the corner read just 17 minutes ago, exactly when I'd begun my rounds tonight. But I'd carried no camera. I never carried a camera during my shifts, had no reason to document anything, and certainly hadn't posed for any pictures. I grabbed another Polaroid with shaking fingers. Again, it was me, this time walking past room 714, my face clearly visible in profile. The timestamp showed 14 minutes ago. Then another, me standing outside room 716, 11 minutes ago. And another, me approaching room 718, just moments before I'd heard the splintering wood. Each photograph documented my progress through the ward with chilling precision, capturing angles and moments that would have been impossible unless someone had been following me, documenting my every move. But the corridors had been empty. I was certain of it. I'd checked every room, every alcove, every possible hiding place during my preliminary sweep. My hands moved frantically through the pile, uncovering more and more images of myself. Me unlocking doors, me checking observation windows, me walking, standing, turning. A complete photographic record of my night shift, taken by an invisible presence that had shadowed my every step. The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing inward as claustrophobia wrapped around my chest like steel bands. My breathing became shallow and rapid, each inhalation burning my lungs. The photographs scattered from my trembling hands as I struggled to stand, my legs weak with a terror I couldn't name. I spun around to check on Delacroix, but he remained exactly as before, unmoving, unseeing, apparently unaware of the chaos that surrounded him. Yet something had changed. His eyes, previously fixed on the ceiling, had shifted. They were now directed at me with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the darkness. A fresh wave of cold sweat washed over my body as I realized he was watching me. Not just looking, watching. His pupils dilated in the flashlight's beam, but there was consciousness there, awareness, intelligence, and something else, something hungry. I stumbled backward, my shoulders striking the doorframe as I fled the room. The corridor outside seemed impossibly long, stretching away from me like a tunnel that led nowhere. My radio crackled with static as I fumbled for the call button, but when I tried to speak, my voice came out as a hoarse whisper. The words I managed to form didn't make sense even to me. I reported the damaged furniture, mentioned that Delacroix appeared stable, but said nothing about the photographs. How could I? Who would believe such an impossible story? The night shift supervisor would think I'd suffered some kind of breakdown, and maybe I had. Maybe that was the only rational explanation. But as I walked back toward the nurse's station, I could feel eyes on me, not just Delacroix's, others. From every room I passed, every observation window, every shadow that the fluorescent lights failed to illuminate, the sensation crawled across my skin like insects, raising goosebumps along my arms and the back of my neck. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Security cameras, perhaps. Some kind of surveillance system I wasn't aware of. But the angles in the photographs didn't match any camera positions I knew about. And besides, the facility used digital equipment, not instant cameras that produced physical prints. The nurse's station felt like a refuge, its bright lights and familiar equipment offering a semblance of normalcy. I sat heavily in the desk chair, my hands still shaking as I reached for the incident report forms. But when I looked down at the desk surface, my blood turned to ice. A new Polaroid lay centered on the blotter, as if someone had placed it there while I was in room 718. This photograph showed me kneeling on the floor of the isolation room, surrounded by scattered pictures, my face a mask of terror and confusion. The timestamp read 3 minutes ago. Someone had been in the nurse's station. Someone had been here, in this supposedly secure area, while I was investigating the disturbance. They'd photographed me through the open doorway of room 718, then returned here to leave this image like a calling card. I sprang from the chair and checked every possible hiding place, behind the filing cabinets, under the desk, in the supply closets. Nothing. The station was empty, just as it had been when I'd left it. Yet the photograph remained. tangible proof that my isolation was an illusion. The radio squawked with the night supervisor's voice, asking for an update on my report. I stared at the device for several long seconds, unable to formulate a response that wouldn't sound like the ravings of a madman. Finally, I reported that everything was under control, that the patient in 718 remained stable, that I was continuing my rounds. But I wasn't continuing anything. I was sitting in a pool of harsh fluorescent light, surrounded by monitoring equipment and filing cabinets, trying to convince myself that reality still followed rules I understood. The photograph on the desk seemed to mock my efforts, its glossy surface reflecting the overhead lights like a malevolent eye. A soft sound from the corridor made me look up. The whisper of footsteps on linoleum, barely audible, but definitely there. I grabbed my flashlight and moved to the station's doorway, peering down the hallway in both directions. The corridor stretched away into shadows, empty and still. But the feeling of being watched had intensified, becoming almost physically oppressive. I forced myself to continue the rounds, checking each room with mechanical precision while fighting the growing conviction that something was fundamentally wrong with the world around me. Mrs. Patterson still whispered to her invisible companions, her voice a susurrating murmur behind her door. Marcus Webb had arranged his sheets into a new configuration, concentric circles that seemed to pulse in the dim light filtering through his observation window. But it was the empty rooms that disturbed me most. Rooms 720, 722, and 724 had been vacant for weeks, awaiting new admissions or maintenance work. Yet as I approached each door, I could swear I heard movement inside, the soft rustle of fabric, the creak of floorboards, the almost inaudible sound of breathing. At room 724, I stopped completely. Through the observation window, I could see what appeared to be a figure standing in the corner farthest from the door. The shape was indistinct in the darkness, but it seemed too tall to be anything but human. Yet the room was supposed to be empty, its door locked, its keycard access restricted to authorized personnel. I unlocked the door with trembling hands, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness like a blade. The room was empty, completely, utterly empty. No furniture, no figure in the corner, nothing but bare walls and institutional carpeting. But the air inside felt warm, as if someone had just been there, and I could detect the faint scent of something organic, not unpleasant, but distinctly human. As I backed out of the room, my flashlight beam swept across the floor and caught something near the doorway. Another Polaroid, face down on the carpet. With mounting dread, I picked it up and turned it over. The image showed me standing in this exact spot, looking through the observation window of room 724. But the photograph had been taken from inside the room, from the corner where I'd thought I'd seen a figure. The timestamp indicated it had been captured just moments ago, while I was standing outside the door. This was impossible. There was no one in that room. I just searched it thoroughly, examined every corner, every possible hiding place. Yet someone had been there, someone with a camera, someone who documented my investigation and then vanished without a trace. My hands were shaking so violently now that I could barely hold the photograph. The corridor around me seemed to shift and waver, as if the very architecture was becoming unstable. The fluorescent lights flickered more rapidly, creating a strobe effect that made the shadows dance and writhe like living things. I had to get back to the nurse's station, had to call for backup, had to report what was happening, even if it destroyed my career. But as I turned to walk back down the corridor, I realized that the hallway had changed. The doors were in the wrong places. Room numbers that should have read 718, 720, 722 now showed 717, 719, 721. The whole sequence had shifted by one, as if reality itself was slipping out of alignment. Panic rose in my throat like bile as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. 23 years of walking these corridors, and now they were rearranging themselves around me like pieces of a puzzle being randomly shuffled. The institutional green walls seemed darker, the ceiling lower, the air thicker and harder to breathe. I ran toward what should have been the nurse's station, my footsteps echoing strangely in the altered space. But when I reached the end of the corridor, I found myself facing a wall where the station should have been. The hallway simply terminated in blank institutional green paint, as if the building had been truncated, cut off mid-design. Behind me, the sound of footsteps had returned, multiple sets now, all moving in perfect synchronization. I turned, flashlight raised, but the beam revealed only empty corridor stretching back the way I'd come. Yet the footsteps continued, growing closer, accompanied now by the soft clicking of what sounded like camera shutters. The realization hit me with crystalline clarity. I was the subject of some impossible documentation project, being photographed and recorded by presences I couldn't see or understand. Every move I made was being captured, cataloged, studied. I was a specimen in an experiment whose parameters I couldn't begin to comprehend. The corridor began to stretch and distort around me, walls flowing like liquid while maintaining their institutional appearance. Room doors multiplied and divided, creating impossible geometries that hurt to look at. The fluorescent lights strobed faster, creating a seizure-inducing pattern that made it difficult to distinguish between shadow and substance. Through it all, the clicking of camera shutters continued, surrounding me now like mechanical rainfall. I stumbled forward, my hands pressed against my ears, trying to block out the sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. My flashlight beam cut wild arcs through the air as I spun around, searching for something solid, something real, something that made sense. That's when I saw him. Vincent Delacroix stood at the far end of the corridor, no longer restrained, no longer motionless. He was holding an old-fashioned instant camera, the kind that ejected Polaroid pictures with a mechanical whir. As I watched in frozen horror, he raised the camera to his eye and took another photograph. The flash illuminated his face for just an instant, revealing features that were somehow both his and not his, familiar yet wrong, as if viewed through distorting glass. But it wasn't just him. Other figures emerged from the rooms along the corridor, each carrying their own camera, each moving with that same mechanical precision. I recognized some of them. Former patients, discharged staff members, people who shouldn't have been here. They formed a gauntlet along the hallway, documenting my terror with cold, methodical efficiency. The walls around me began to pulse with a life of their own, expanding and contracting like the chambers of some vast heart. The very air shimmered with heat distortion, making it difficult to focus on any single detail. My vision blurred as sweat poured into my eyes, but I couldn't wipe it away. My hands were frozen at my sides, paralyzed by a terror so complete it had transcended ordinary fear and become something else entirely. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The corridor snapped back to its normal configuration. The fluorescent lights steadied their glow. The camera-wielding figures vanished like smoke. I found myself standing alone in the familiar hallway of Ward 7, my flashlight beam illuminating nothing more threatening than institutional green walls and numbered doors. But when I looked down at my feet, I saw them. Dozens of Polaroid photographs scattered across the linoleum like evidence of a crime that had never been committed. Each one showed me in various stages of my journey through the impossible corridor, my face a study in escalating terror, my body language revealing the complete dissolution of my professional composure. I gathered the photographs with numb fingers, stuffing them into my jacket pockets without looking at them too closely. The nurse's station had returned to its proper location, the radio crackling with routine communications from other parts of the facility. Everything was normal, routine, exactly as it should be, except for the knowledge that I was being watched, cataloged, documented by something that existed in the spaces between reality and nightmare. As I sat at the desk to complete my shift report, I could feel invisible eyes tracking my every movement, unseen cameras recording my attempts to maintain the illusion of normalcy. The photographs in my pocket seemed to burn against my chest, physical proof of an experience that logic insisted couldn't have happened. But when I finally worked up the courage to look at them again, they showed nothing but empty corridors and mundane institutional spaces. No terror, no impossible geometries, no camera-wielding figures. Just me, walking through Ward 7 on a routine night shift, alone and unobserved. But I knew better now. I understood that surveillance could exist beyond the mechanical, that documentation could transcend the physical. Somewhere in the walls, in the shadows, in the spaces between seconds, something was always watching, always recording, always waiting for the next opportunity to remind me that reality was far more fragile than I'd ever imagined. The rest of my shift passed without incident, but I never stopped feeling those invisible eyes upon me. Even now, writing this report, I can sense them cataloging my every word, preserving this moment for some unknowable purpose. And sometimes, in the corner of my vision, I catch the faintest glimmer of a camera flash. Story 8. The air in the Whitmore building's attic tasted of decades-old dust and something else, something that made my throat constrict every time I breathed too deeply. It was the kind of staleness that seemed to coat your lungs, thick and oppressive, like the building itself was exhaling its accumulated years of secrets with each labored breath I took. I'd been working up there for 3 weeks now, cataloging the endless boxes of municipal records that had been accumulating since the 1920s. The city had finally decided to digitize everything, and I was the unlucky contractor who'd bid lowest on the job. Most nights I worked alone until dawn, when the building's daytime security guard would arrive, and I could finally escape the suffocating atmosphere that seemed to press down harder with each passing hour. The fluorescent lights flickered constantly, casting erratic shadows that made the towering stacks of cardboard boxes appear to shift and sway. I'd mentioned the faulty wiring to the building supervisor, but he'd just shrugged and told me the electrical system was older than both of us combined. The work had to be done at night anyway. The building's main floors were occupied by various city departments during business hours, and they couldn't afford the disruption of me hauling boxes up and down the narrow stairwell. By the second week, I'd noticed the small things. The way certain boxes felt colder than others, even though they'd been sitting in the same area for hours. How the temperature would drop suddenly in random spots, making me pull my jacket tighter around my shoulders. The building's heating system was probably just as ancient as everything else, I reasoned, though the cold spots never seemed to align with any logical pattern of air circulation. The scratching sounds started during my 3rd week. Faint at first, like mice scurrying behind the walls, but too rhythmic, too deliberate. They came in sets of 3, always from the northeastern corner where the oldest records were stored. I'd investigated several times, moving boxes and checking for any signs of rodent activity, but found nothing except dust and the lingering smell of old paper that had begun to take on an almost sweet, cloying quality that made my stomach turn. My sleep schedule had become completely inverted. I'd arrive at the building around 10 p.m., when the last of the evening cleaning crew finished their rounds and work until sunrise. The security guard, a heavy-set man named Carl who spoke mostly in grunts, would unlock the building for me and disappear to his basement office, where he spent the night watching grainy security monitors and drinking coffee that smelled like it had been brewing since the Carter administration. The silence during those hours was absolute in a way that felt unnatural for a building located in the downtown core. No traffic noise penetrated the thick walls. No sounds from neighboring buildings. Even my own movement seemed muffled, as if the air itself was absorbing every sound before it could properly propagate. The only consistent noise was the humming of the failing fluorescent lights and the occasional groan of the building settling, though those groans often sounded too purposeful, too much like something large shifting its weight in the darkness. I'd developed a routine to maintain my sanity. Every hour I'd take a 5-minute break, stepping out onto the small balcony that overlooked the alley behind the building. The fresh air helped clear the dust from my lungs and gave me a chance to remind myself that there was still a world outside those oppressive walls. But even those breaks had started to feel wrong. I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder as I stood outside, as if something was watching me from within the attic, waiting for me to return. The photographs appeared during my 4th week. I'd been working through a box of personnel files from the 1940s when I found them, a manila envelope containing a dozen black and white photographs that had no business being in municipal employment records. They showed the interior of the attic, but from a different era. The same exposed beams, the same small windows, but empty of the filing cabinets and cardboard boxes that now filled every available space. In several of the photographs, a woman stood near the northeastern corner, partially obscured by shadows. She wore a dark dress typical of the 1940s, and her face was turned away from the camera in every shot. Something about her posture suggested she wasn't posing for the photographs. Rather, she appeared to be caught in motion, as if the photographer had been trying to document something else entirely, and she'd simply been present in the frame. The photographs made my hands shake as I examined them more closely. The woman's dress seemed to ripple in the still images, creating an illusion of movement that hurt my eyes to focus on. I told myself it was just the poor quality of the film, the way old photographs sometimes created strange artifacts, but my rational mind was fighting against something deeper, something that recognized a wrongness in those images that went beyond mere technical imperfection. I should have left the photographs in the box and continued with my work. Instead, I spread them across my makeshift work table, studying each one under the harsh fluorescent light. The woman appeared in 7 of the 12 photographs, always in the same general area, always with her face turned away. In the final photograph of the sequence, she was gone entirely, but the shadows in the corner seemed darker, more substantial, as if her absence had somehow given them weight. That night, the scratching sounds became more insistent. Sets of 3, then silence, then sets of 3 again. But now they seemed to be responding to my movements. When I walked toward the northeastern corner to investigate, the sounds would stop entirely. When I returned to my work table, they would resume within minutes. By 2 a.m., my nerves were frayed enough that I was jumping at every creak of the building, every flicker of the overhead lights. I tried to focus on my work, methodically documenting each file and preparing the documents for scanning, but my attention kept drifting to those photographs. I'd catch myself staring at them, searching for details I might have missed, trying to make sense of why they'd been mixed in with employment records. The woman's posture was becoming familiar in a way that made my skin crawl, something about the angle of her shoulders, the way her head was tilted, as if she was listening for something. At 3:05 a.m., the temperature dropped so suddenly that my breath became visible. I looked up from the 1952 tax assessment records I'd been cataloging, watching my exhalation form small clouds in the air that had been comfortably warm just moments before. The fluorescent lights flickered more rapidly, creating a stroboscopic effect that made the shadows dance wildly across the walls. My heart rate picked up, that primal recognition of danger that bypassed rational thought and went straight to the nervous system. The scratching sounds had stopped completely. The silence that replaced them was somehow worse, a dead, empty quiet that seemed to press against my eardrums. I stood slowly, my chair creaking in the sudden cold, and pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders. The temperature continued to drop, and I could feel goosebumps rising along my arms despite the layers of clothing. That's when I saw her. At exactly 3:07 a.m., according to the digital clock on my phone, she emerged from the northeastern corner where the oldest records were stored. Not walking, emerging, as if the shadows themselves had given birth to her translucent form. She wore the same dark dress from the photographs, and her face remained turned away as she moved with purpose toward the center of the attic. My throat constricted, making it impossible to breathe properly. My heart hammered against my ribs so violently that I was certain it would burst. Every rational thought fled my mind, replaced by pure animal terror that made my legs weak and my hands shake uncontrollably. She was there, solid enough to disturb the dust on the floor as she moved, but transparent enough that I could see the filing cabinets behind her through her body. I watched, frozen in place, as she approached the first of 2 locked doors that led to storage areas I'd never been able to access. The building supervisor had told me those rooms contained structural equipment and were off limits. She reached the door and simply continued forward, passing through the solid wood as if it were made of air. The sight of her translucent form disappearing into the door made my stomach lurch, and I tasted bile at the back of my throat. Seconds later, she emerged from the second locked door, having traversed the sealed storage space between them. She paused there, finally turning her head in my direction, though her face remained obscured by shadows that seemed to cling to her features like a living thing. The air around me grew so cold that my teeth began to chatter, and I could feel ice crystals forming in my nostrils with each labored breath. Then I felt it, a touch of air so cold it burned, sliding across the back of my neck like phantom fingers. The sensation made every nerve in my body fire at once, sending violent tremors through my limbs. I spun around, certain someone was behind me, but found only empty space and the familiar stacks of boxes and filing cabinets. When I turned back toward where she'd been standing, she was gone, but hanging in the air where she'd paused, formed from the same condensed breath that was still streaming from my own mouth, I saw something that made my sanity fracture just a little bit more. My name, spelled out in crystallized moisture, the letters forming and dissipating in the freezing air like a message written in winter fog. The sight of it made my knees buckle, and I gripped the edge of my work table to keep from falling. The rational part of my mind screamed that it was impossible. Just a trick of the light and the sudden temperature change. But the letters had been too clear, too deliberate. Someone, or something, had spoken my name with such force that it had become visible in the frigid air. The temperature began to return to normal almost immediately, but the psychological damage was already done. I stood there for several minutes, my entire body trembling uncontrollably, waiting for my heart rate to slow enough that I could think clearly again. The familiar sounds of the building returned gradually. The humming of the lights, the settling groans, even the scratching from the northeastern corner. Though it seemed more distant now, almost apologetic. I looked at the photographs scattered across my work table, and for the first time, I could see the woman's face in the shadows. It was a face I recognized, though I couldn't place where I'd seen it before. Not from any personal encounter, but from somewhere deeper in my memory, as if it had been waiting there all along for the right moment to surface. The rest of the night passed in a haze of caffeine and nervous energy. I continued working, mechanically processing files and preparing documents, but my attention was constantly drawn to the northeastern corner and the photographs that seemed to pulse with their own malevolent life under the harsh fluorescent lights. Every sound made me jump. Every flicker of the lights made my breath catch in my throat. When Carl arrived at dawn to relieve me, he took one look at my face and asked if I was feeling all right. I told him I'd been fighting off a cold, which wasn't entirely untrue. My throat was raw from breathing the freezing air, and my nose was still running from the sudden temperature change. He nodded sympathetically and mentioned that several people had complained about the building's heating system acting up in recent weeks. I packed up my materials and headed for the stairwell, but paused at the door to look back at the attic one final time. In the growing daylight filtering through the small windows, the space looked almost benign. Just an ordinary storage area filled with the detritus of municipal bureaucracy. But I knew I'd be back that night, drawn by the same perverse fascination that makes people slow down to look at accident scenes. As I descended the narrow stairwell, I could hear the scratching sounds resume behind me. 3 deliberate scratches, then silence, then 3 more. The pattern followed me down 2 flights of stairs before finally fading into the distance. I didn't sleep well that day. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her translucent form moving through those locked doors, and I felt that burning touch of impossibly cold air on the back of my neck. But more disturbing than the supernatural encounter itself was the growing certainty that I'd seen her face before, somewhere in the countless files I'd been processing. She wasn't just a random spirit haunting the building. She was connected to something specific, something buried in those decades of municipal records. That evening, I returned to the Whitmore building with a new sense of purpose. The terror was still there, coiled in my stomach like a living thing, but it was now accompanied by an obsessive need to understand what I'd witnessed. I spread the photographs across my work table again and began searching through the personnel files with renewed focus, looking for any reference to a woman who matched the figure I'd seen. I found her file just after midnight, buried in a box of employment records from 1947. Her name was Margaret Westford, and she'd worked as a night clerk in the Municipal Archives Department. According to the documentation, she'd been assigned to organize and maintain the historical records stored in the building's attic. The file contained a single photograph, her official employee headshot, and seeing her face clearly for the first time made my blood run cold. It was the same woman from the mysterious photographs, the same woman I'd seen moving through the locked doors. But in her employee photo, she was smiling, alive, her eyes bright with intelligence and purpose. The contrast between that vibrant image and the hollow, shadow-cloaked figure I'd encountered made my hands shake as I continued reading through her file. Margaret Westford had disappeared in December 1947. According to the incident report, she'd been working alone in the attic when the overnight security guard heard screaming from the upper floors. By the time he reached the attic, she was gone. The only evidence of her presence was an overturned chair and several scattered personnel files. The investigation concluded that she'd suffered some kind of mental breakdown and fled the building, though her body was never found and she was never seen again. But I knew better now. She hadn't fled the building. She'd never left at all. The scratching sounds that night were more insistent than ever, and I finally understood what they were. Not random sounds from settling wood or small animals, but the sound of someone trying to organize files in the darkness, continuing the work that had never been finished. Margaret Westford was still here, still attempting to complete the task that had consumed her in life, trapped in an endless loop of bureaucratic dedication that transcended death itself. As 3 a.m. approached, I found myself both dreading and anticipating her appearance. The temperature began to drop right on schedule, and I watched my breath become visible in the frigid air. But this time, I didn't run. This time I waited, and when she emerged from the northeastern corner at exactly 3:07, I was ready. She moved through her ritual of passing through the locked doors, but when she paused and turned toward me, I spoke her name aloud. The word formed a visible cloud in the freezing air, hanging between us like a bridge across the decades. For just a moment, her shadowed face seemed to clear, and I saw recognition in her eyes. Not of me specifically, but of being acknowledged, of being remembered after all these years of invisible labor. Then she was gone, and the temperature returned to normal, but something fundamental had changed. The scratching sounds ceased entirely, replaced by a silence that felt peaceful rather than oppressive. The building itself seemed to exhale, releasing decades of accumulated tension in a single, shuddering breath. I never saw Margaret Westford again, though I continued working in the attic for several more weeks until the digitization project was complete. But sometimes, when I arrived in the morning to relieve Carl, he would mention that the overnight security monitors had picked up unusual activity in the upper floors, the sound of boxes being moved and papers being shuffled, as if someone was working diligently through the night to organize the chaos of accumulated years. The photographs disappeared from the personnel files sometime during my final week on the project. I checked the box multiple times, searching through every document, but they were simply gone, as if they'd never existed at all. In their place, I found Margaret Westford's employee file, but now it contained a note that hadn't been there before, a brief addendum stating that all missing persons investigations had been resolved, and the case was officially closed. I finished the digitization project without incident, delivering the completed digital archive to the city administrators, who seemed surprised that I'd managed to organize and catalog everything so efficiently. They praised my thoroughness and attention to detail, though I knew the credit belonged to someone else, someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of municipal record-keeping in the cold, silent hours before dawn. On my final night in the Whitmore building, I left a small note in the northeastern corner where the oldest records had been stored. It simply read, "Thank you for your service, Margaret. Your work is complete." The next morning, Carl found the note exactly where I'd placed it, but the handwriting had changed. Below my message, in the precise script of a 1940s municipal clerk, someone had added a single word. Finally. The building was demolished 6 months later to make way for a modern city complex. But I've heard from the demolition crew that they found something unusual in the basement, a small office that didn't appear on any of the building's blueprints, containing a desk, a chair, and several boxes of perfectly organized files that spanned decades of municipal records. The files were so well maintained and comprehensive that the city decided to incorporate them into their permanent archives. I sometimes wonder if Margaret Westford finally found her way out of that attic when the building came down, or if she simply relocated to wherever those perfectly organized files were eventually stored. Either way, I hope she found peace and completion, in the knowledge that her work was finally recognized and preserved. But late at night, when I'm working alone in my own office, I sometimes hear the faint sound of papers being shuffled in the distance, and I remember the touch of impossibly cold air on the back of my neck, and the sight of my own name hanging in the frigid air like a greeting from beyond the veil of ordinary experience. Some kinds of dedication, I've learned, transcend the boundaries between life and death, creating their own kind of immortality in the endless pursuit of order amidst chaos. Story 9. The apartment smelled like decades of other people's secrets, stale cigarettes, forgotten meals, and something else I couldn't quite place. Something that made my skin crawl the moment I stepped inside. But the rent was cheap, disgracefully so for downtown, and my bank account wasn't in any position to be choosy. The first time it happened, I convinced myself it was just coincidence. I'd been living in apartment 3B for exactly 4 days when I shuffled past the hallway mirror on my way to the kitchen, catching a glimpse of my reflection and the digital clock mounted on the opposite wall behind me. 11:11. I stopped, blinked, looked again. The red numbers glowed mockingly in the mirror's surface. My heart did that little skip it does when something feels off, but I shook my head and continued to the kitchen. Coincidences happen. People notice patterns where there aren't any. That's what I told myself as I made coffee with shaking hands I attributed to caffeine withdrawal. But it happened again the next morning, 7:07, and that evening, 10:10. By the end of the first week, my stomach had developed a permanent knot. Every time I walked past that mirror, which was unavoidable given the apartment's narrow layout, those damn numbers stared back at me in perfect symmetry. The digital clock seemed to mock me from its reflection, always showing doubles when I happened to glance at it. I started timing my movements, trying to catch it off guard. I'd sprint past the mirror at random times, whip around suddenly, even tried crawling past it on my hands and knees like some kind of lunatic. But somehow, every single time my eyes met that glass surface, the clock displayed matching digits. 3:33, 6:06, 12:12. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through rational explanations. Maybe the clock was broken. Maybe I was subconsciously timing my movements. Maybe the stress of the move, the new job, the financial pressure was making me paranoid. But my body knew better. My heart hammered against my ribcage whenever I approached the hallway. Sweat would bead on my forehead despite the apartment's perpetual chill. My mouth went dry, and I'd find myself holding my breath as I passed the mirror, as if the act of breathing might somehow make things worse. 2 weeks in, I decided to cover the mirror. It seemed like the logical solution. If I couldn't see the reflection, maybe the phenomenon would stop. I draped an old bedsheet over the ornate frame, tucking the corners behind the mirror's edges. The white cotton hung there like a surrender flag, and for the first time since moving in, I felt my shoulders relax. The relief lasted exactly 6 hours. I was carrying a load of laundry to the bedroom when I heard it. A soft rustling, like fabric sliding against wood. I turned toward the hallway, and my blood turned to ice. The sheet had fallen to the floor in a crumpled heap, and the mirror's surface gleamed in the dim overhead light. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what I saw in the reflection. There were 3 of me. 3 identical figures standing in the narrow hallway, each one positioned slightly differently. The leftmost version had his head tilted to the right. The center figure stood perfectly straight. The rightmost had his head cocked to the left. All 3 wore the same expression of growing horror as realization dawned. My throat constricted, choking off the scream that tried to escape. I stood frozen, laundry basket clutched against my chest like a shield, watching my 3 reflections watch me back. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. Then the leftmost figure blinked. 2 seconds later, the center figure blinked. Another 2 seconds, and the rightmost version followed suit. Meanwhile, I hadn't blinked at all. My eyes burned with the effort of keeping them open, tears starting to form at the corners. But I couldn't look away. The pattern continued. Left, center, right, each blink coming exactly 2 seconds after the previous one, while I stood paralyzed in the hallway. My hands began to shake violently. The laundry basket slipped from my grip, dirty clothes scattering across the floor. The sound of fabric hitting hardwood seemed to break whatever spell held me, and I stumbled backward until my back hit the wall opposite the mirror. From this new angle, I could only see one reflection, my own, looking pale and terrified and blessedly singular. But I could feel the other two versions of myself still there, just out of view, continuing their delayed blinking in perfect sequence. I spent the night in the living room, as far from the hallway as possible. Every creak of the old building made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move independently. The digital clock on the microwave became my enemy, its numbers changing with mechanical precision while I watched from the couch, afraid to look away for too long. Sleep came in fractured pieces, filled with dreams of infinite reflection stretching into darkness, each one slightly out of sync with the others. I'd wake with my heart pounding, sweat soaking through my t-shirt, the taste of copper in my mouth from biting my tongue. The next morning, I called in sick to work. My voice came out as a croak when I spoke to my supervisor, who asked if I needed to see a doctor. I almost laughed at the absurdity. What would I tell a doctor? That my reflection was multiplying? That time itself seemed to be playing games with me? I spent the day researching the apartment building's history, scouring online records and city archives for any clues about what might be happening. The building was old, constructed in 1892, and had served various purposes over the decades. Boarding house, low-income housing, even a brief stint as artist studios in the 1960s. But I found nothing about mirrors, nothing about supernatural phenomena, nothing that might explain why my reflection had decided to rebel against the laws of physics. As evening approached, my anxiety reached a fever pitch. My hands trembled as I made dinner, dropping utensils and spilling water. Every peripheral movement made me whip my head around, convinced I'd seen something that shouldn't be there. The apartment felt smaller somehow, the walls pressing in like the building itself was trying to squeeze me out. But I had to pass the mirror eventually. The bathroom was on the other side of the hallway, and my bladder wasn't going to wait for my psychological issues to resolve themselves. I approached the mirror like a condemned man walking to his execution. Each step felt leaden, my legs heavy with dread. The overhead light flickered, casting dancing shadows that made everything seem to move. My reflection appeared gradually as I entered the mirror's field of view, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. Then I saw the clock. 8:08. And I saw all three versions of myself again. This time, they weren't just blinking out of sequence. The leftmost figure was smiling, a slow, knowing grin that spread across his face while I stood there with my mouth hanging open in terror. The center figure remained neutral, watching with the detached interest of a scientist observing an experiment. The rightmost version was frowning, his brow furrowed as if he was trying to solve a puzzle. I raised my right hand, testing. Only the center figure mimicked the movement. The other two continued their independent expressions, existing in their own pocket of reality that somehow shared space with mine. My pulse hammered in my ears, so loud I was sure the neighbors could hear it through the thin walls. The air in the hallway felt thick, like breathing through wet cotton. I wanted to run, to flee the apartment and never come back, but my legs felt rooted to the floor. The smiling version of myself began to mouth words. I couldn't hear anything, but I could read his lips clearly. "You're not supposed to be here." Terror flooded my system like ice water in my veins. My vision blurred at the edges, and for a moment I thought I might pass out. But I forced myself to stay conscious, to keep watching, because some primal part of my brain insisted that looking away would be even worse. The frowning figure was mouthing something too. "Neither are we." And the center figure, my apparently normal reflection, spoke in perfect synchronization with my own voice. But here we all are. I hadn't intended to speak. The words came out of my mouth without my permission, my vocal cords moving independently while my mind screamed in confusion. The sound of my own voice, speaking words I hadn't chosen, sent fresh waves of panic through my nervous system. I stumbled backward, breaking eye contact with the mirror, and immediately felt some of the pressure lift from my chest. But I could still sense them there, my other selves, existing in that reflected space, probably still watching the empty hallway where I'd been standing. That night, I packed everything I could fit into 2 suitcases. I was done trying to rationalize what was happening, done pretending there might be a logical explanation. Whatever was wrong with that mirror, whatever was wrong with this apartment, I wanted no part of it. But as I was loading my bags into my car, parked under the flickering streetlight outside the building, I caught sight of my reflection in the driver's side window. There were still 3 of me. The realization hit like a physical blow. Whatever connection had been forged between me and those other versions of myself, it wasn't confined to the apartment. It had followed me outside, into the night, into what should have been the safety of the real world. I stood there in the orange glow of the streetlight, staring at my triple reflection in the car window, and understood with crystalline clarity that running wouldn't solve anything. The problem wasn't the mirror, wasn't the apartment, wasn't even the building. The problem was me. Or rather, the problem was that there were now 3 of me, existing simultaneously in space, that should only have room for one. And judging by the expressions on the other 2 faces, one still smiling, that knowing grin, the other still frowning in concentration, they had no intention of going back to whatever reality they'd escaped from. I got back in the car and drove to a motel on the outskirts of town, paying cash for a room with no mirrors except the small one bolted above the bathroom sink. But even there, in that sterile space that smelled of disinfectant and stale cigarettes, I could feel them watching me. The digital clock on the nightstand read 11:47 when I finally tried to sleep. But every time I closed my eyes, I could sense those other versions of myself, living their own lives in whatever parallel space they occupied, making their own decisions, thinking their own thoughts. And sometimes, just as I was drifting off, I could swear I heard them whispering. I never did find out what they were trying to tell me, but I learned to live with the knowledge that somewhere, in the reflection of every surface, 2 other versions of myself were living lives that should have been impossible. The rent for apartment 3B really had been too good to be true. Story 10. The silence in Millfield Rehabilitation Center after midnight wasn't the peaceful kind that brought rest. It was the suffocating quiet of a place that held its breath, waiting for something terrible to wake up. The first time I heard the bouncing, I thought someone had left a television on in one of the abandoned rooms downstairs. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump echoed through the ventilation system, seeping into my small office on the 2nd floor, where I'd been catching up on patient files. As the night security supervisor, I'd grown accustomed to the building's odd sounds, the settling of old pipes, the wheeze of the ancient heating system, the occasional creak of expansion joints. But this was different, deliberate, methodical. I set down my coffee and listened more carefully. The sound was moving, traveling from somewhere deep in the ground floor toward the main corridor. My mouth went dry as I realized the pattern wasn't random. It was the unmistakable bounce of a ball, growing louder, getting closer. The ground floor had been sealed off for 3 months following a pipe burst that flooded the entire level. The insurance company was still fighting with contractors over mold remediation, leaving that section of the building as dead space. No one had access except the maintenance crew, and they'd finished their work hours ago. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for my flashlight and keys. The building's emergency lighting cast long shadows down the corridors, but most of the ground floor remained pitch black. As I descended the main staircase, the bouncing sound grew clearer, more distinct. My heart hammered against my ribs with each step downward. The sound stopped. I froze halfway down the stairs, straining to hear anything in the sudden silence. My breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the building's perpetual chill. Something was wrong. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. But I couldn't identify what exactly had triggered every alarm bell in my nervous system. Then I saw it. A red rubber ball sat at the bottom of the stairs, perfectly still, as if it had been waiting for me. The emergency exit sign above cast a sickly green glow across its surface, making it appear almost luminescent in the darkness. My throat constricted as I stared at the impossible object. How had it gotten there? Who could have been bouncing it through a sealed, empty floor? I descended the remaining steps slowly, my flashlight beam dancing nervously across the walls. The ball was old, the kind of cheap playground equipment that might have been used in the physical therapy sessions before the flood. Its surface was cracked and faded, with deep grooves where fingernails or small teeth had worried at the rubber. As I bent to examine it more closely, something struck my left shin with surprising force. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. The ball had moved, launched itself directly into my leg with enough momentum to leave a sharp ache. But that was impossible. I'd been watching it the entire time, and it had been completely motionless just seconds before. My pulse thundered in my ears as I swept the flashlight beam in wide arcs around the corridor. Empty doorways gaped like open mouths on either side of me. The silence felt alive now, pressing against my eardrums with an almost physical weight. Every shadow seemed to shift and writhe at the edge of my vision. The ball sat innocently at my feet again, as if nothing had happened. I picked it up with shaking hands. The rubber felt wrong, too warm, as if it had been sitting in sunlight rather than lying on a cold linoleum floor. The surface was slightly sticky, leaving a faint residue on my palms that smelled metallic and organic, like old blood mixed with something sweet and rotting. The smart thing would have been to leave it there, to radio for backup, to document the incident properly. Instead, I found myself walking deeper into the abandoned floor, toward the storage rooms where maintenance kept their equipment. If someone was playing a prank, I wanted to understand how they'd gained access. If something else was happening, something I couldn't yet allow myself to name, I needed to know. The storage room was exactly where I remembered it, behind a heavy steel door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." The lock had been changed after the flood, and my master key turned smoothly in the new mechanism. Inside, shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with cleaning supplies, replacement parts, and miscellaneous equipment. I placed the ball on an empty shelf near the back and locked the door behind me. The next evening, my shift began with a report from the day supervisor about strange sounds coming from the ground floor. Maintenance had checked the sealed areas and found nothing unusual, but 3 different staff members had complained about hearing rhythmic bouncing noises around midnight. I didn't mention my own encounter. How could I explain that I'd somehow gained access to a restricted area to chase after a ball that had seemingly attacked me? Instead, I assured them I'd investigate thoroughly during my rounds. At 12:17 a.m., the bouncing started again. This time I was ready. I'd positioned myself in the main lobby with a clear view of the stairwell, determined to catch whoever was responsible for the disturbance. But as the sound grew closer, my confidence evaporated. No footsteps accompanied the bouncing. No voices or whispered laughter suggested human involvement. Just that steady, mechanical rhythm of rubber meeting floor, moving with purpose through the darkness below. The ball appeared at the top of the stairs as if it had rolled itself there. It paused for a moment, and I could swear it was somehow looking at me despite having no visible features beyond its cracked red surface. Then it began rolling directly toward where I stood. My legs felt like concrete as I watched it approach. Every rational part of my mind screamed that balls don't move on their own, that someone had to be controlling it through hidden strings or electronic devices. But my primitive brain, the part that had kept our ancestors alive in caves and forests, recognized something predatory in its movement. It struck my shin again, in exactly the same spot as the night before. The impact was harder this time, leaving a bruise I could feel forming immediately beneath my pants. As I bent to rub the injury, the ball rolled in a small circle around my feet, like a dog marking its territory. I snatched it up and hurried toward the storage room, my flashlight beam jerking wildly across the walls. The building felt larger than it should have, as if the corridors had stretched while I wasn't looking. Door frames seemed askew, and familiar landmarks appeared slightly wrong, displaced by inches or degrees that my eyes registered, but my mind couldn't quite process. The storage room door stood open. I knew I'd locked it the night before. I distinctly remembered checking the handle twice, hearing the solid click of the deadbolt engaging. But now it gaped wide, revealing the dark interior beyond. My hands shook as I stepped inside and swept my light across the shelves. The ball I'd left there was gone. In its place, a thin layer of white powder covered the shelf surface. Footprints led from the shelf to the door, small prints, no larger than a child's shoe, but wrong somehow. The proportions were off, as if whatever had made them wasn't quite human. I set the new ball down in the same spot and backed out of the room, locking the door with exaggerated care. But even as I turned the key, I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever was happening here operated by rules I didn't understand, in ways that made mockery of locks and rational expectations. The pattern continued for the next week. Every night at the same time, the bouncing would begin. Every night, the ball would find me no matter where I positioned myself in the building. And every morning, I'd discover the storage room door open, the previous night's ball missing, and fresh footprints in the white powder that seemed to regenerate itself with each occurrence. I began documenting everything, taking photographs of the footprints, measuring the time intervals, noting the exact location of each impact against my leg. The bruises were accumulating now, overlapping purple and yellow marks that made walking painful. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the growing certainty that something was terribly wrong with reality itself. The footprints were the most disturbing detail. They appeared human at first glance, but closer examination revealed subtle wrongness. Toes that were too long, an arch that curved at an impossible angle, heel marks that suggested backward jointed ankles. Whatever was leaving these tracks had learned to walk by observing humans, but hadn't quite mastered the mechanics. Sleep became impossible. Even during my off hours, I found myself lying awake, listening for the sound of bouncing rubber. My apartment felt unsafe, too far from the center where I might find answers. I began staying late after my shifts, researching the building's history in online databases and archived newspaper articles. Millfield had opened in 1987 as a progressive rehabilitation facility, specializing in patients with traumatic brain injuries and severe psychological disorders. The early years had been marked by several unusual incidents. Patients reporting shared hallucinations, staff complaints about equipment moving on its own, and a disproportionate number of resignation letters that cited unexplained phenomena as the reason for leaving. In 1991, the facility had briefly closed following what news reports described as a therapeutic incident. Details were sparse, but I found references to experimental treatments that had gone wrong, patients who had been harmed, and families who had filed lawsuits that were quickly settled out of court. When Millfield reopened 6 months later, it was under new management with strictly conventional treatment protocols. The ground floor had always been problematic. Staff turnover was highest in that section, and patient recovery rates were inexplicably lower than on other floors. Maintenance requests mentioned recurring issues with electrical systems, plumbing problems that defied logic, and temperature fluctuations that seemed to follow no natural pattern. One night, as I sat in the storage room waiting for the inevitable arrival of the ball, I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. The white powder wasn't just covering the shelf where I'd placed the ball, it was everywhere. Thin lines of it traced patterns across the floor, spiraling outward from the center of the room like a massive fingerprint. And in that fingerprint, hundreds of small footprints created a complex mandala of movement, as if something had been dancing there for hours. I followed one of the powder trails with my flashlight beam. It led out of the storage room, down the corridor, up the stairs to the main floor, and directly to my office. There, on my desk, sat a red ball, but not the one I'd been chasing. This one was new, unmarked, with a surface so perfect it seemed to glow with its own internal light. As I stared at it, understanding crashed over me like a physical blow. I wasn't chasing the same ball every night. I was feeding some kind of collection, providing fresh objects for something that had learned to mimic human activities but couldn't quite grasp their purpose. The bouncing wasn't random, it was a summons, a dinner bell calling me to deliver the next offering. My hands trembled as I reached for my radio to call for backup, but the device was dead. My cell phone showed no signal. Even the landline in my office produced only silence when I lifted the receiver. Whatever was happening had isolated me completely within the building's walls. The ball began to move on my desk, rolling in slow circles that gradually grew wider. With each revolution, it moved closer to the edge, and I found myself backing toward the door despite every rational thought telling me to stay put and figure out what was happening. But rationality had abandoned me somewhere between the first bouncing sound and the impossible footprints in white powder. I ran. Through the corridors, up the stairs, toward the main entrance where surely the outside world still existed in all its mundane normalcy. But the building seemed to stretch ahead of me, corridors multiplying and intersecting in ways that defied the architectural plans I'd memorized during my orientation. Emergency exit signs pointed in contradictory directions, and familiar landmarks appeared and disappeared like mirages. Behind me, the bouncing sound had multiplied. Not one ball now, but dozens, maybe hundreds, all moving in perfect synchronization. The rhythm was faster than before, more urgent, as if whatever controlled them was excited by my flight. I burst through what I thought was the main entrance and found myself in the storage room again. The ball I'd left there sat exactly where I'd placed it, but now the white powder covered every surface. Walls, ceiling, even the air itself seemed thick with floating particles that made breathing difficult. The bouncing stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear something else. Whispers in a language I didn't recognize, coming from everywhere and nowhere. The sounds were barely audible, more felt than heard, but they carried an unmistakable tone of satisfaction. Whatever had been hunting me through the building's twisted geometry had finally cornered its prey. I closed my eyes and forced myself to think clearly. The building was real. The flood damage was real. The rehabilitation center's troubled history was documented fact. But something else lived here now. Something that fed on confusion and fear, that used familiar objects to lure victims into its web of impossible spaces. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my office. The red ball sat on my desk, innocuous and still. Outside the windows, dawn was breaking across the parking lot, and my relief shift was probably arriving for the morning. The building felt normal again, just an ordinary structure with ordinary problems and ordinary explanations for every strange occurrence. But I knew better now. I understood that some hungers are ancient and patient, that some predators don't need teeth or claws to feed. They need only our willingness to rationalize the impossible, to explain away the evidence of our own senses, until we've trapped ourselves in labyrinths of our own making. I wrote my resignation letter that morning, effective immediately. As I cleaned out my desk, I left the red ball exactly where I'd found it. Let someone else chase the bouncing sounds through the darkness below. Let someone else discover the footprints that led nowhere and everywhere at once. But sometimes, in the early hours before dawn, I still hear that rhythmic bouncing in my dreams. And when I wake, I check my shins for fresh bruises, searching for proof that I've truly escaped the hungry darkness that waits beneath Millfield Rehabilitation Center. The proof is always there. Story 11. Something was wrong with the house from the moment I signed the papers, though I couldn't place exactly what. Maybe it was the way the realtor's smile never quite reached her eyes, or how she hurried through the final walkthrough, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors with an urgency that seemed almost desperate. The previous owners had left in a rush, she explained, taking only what they could carry. Personal emergency, she said, though she wouldn't elaborate when I pressed for details. I should have trusted that first instinct. The moving truck pulled away on a Tuesday afternoon, leaving me alone with boxes stacked like cardboard monuments throughout the empty rooms. The house felt larger than it had during my visits, the shadows deeper, the silence more complete. I told myself it was normal. New houses always felt different until you made them home. But as I wandered through the rooms that evening, unpacking essentials, that nagging sensation of wrongness clung to me like smoke. It wasn't until I reached the master bedroom that I discovered the first real problem. The bed frame was gone. I stood in the doorway, staring at the space where it should have been. The movers had delivered the mattress as requested, But instead of resting on the metal frame I'd specifically asked them to set up, it lay directly on what appeared to be loose wooden planks, rough, unfinished boards that looked like they'd been hastily arranged across the floor in a rectangle barely larger than the mattress itself. My heart rate picked up slightly as I knelt beside the makeshift platform. The boards were different sizes, some wider than others, none of them properly secured. They shifted under my weight when I pressed down, creaking ominously. Between the gaps, I could see only darkness, not the subfloor I expected, but what seemed like empty space. I called the moving company immediately. The dispatcher informed me that my bed frame had been damaged during transport and was being repaired. They could deliver it next week, she said, her voice flat and disinterested. When I mentioned the strange wooden arrangement, she claimed to have no knowledge of it. The previous owners must have left it, she suggested, though that made no sense at all. That night, I slept on the living room couch. The following day brought a parade of service calls, internet installation, utility connections, the mundane rituals of establishing residence. Each technician who entered the bedroom made some comment about the unusual flooring arrangement. The cable guy asked if I was renovating. The electrician wondered aloud why anyone would remove a subfloor without replacement. Their questions echoed my own growing unease, but none could offer explanations. By the second evening, exhaustion overrode caution. The couch had left my back aching, and the bedroom's king-size mattress beckoned despite its precarious foundation. I tested the boards again, pressing firmly on each one. They held my weight, though they groaned and shifted with every movement. Deciding it was safe enough for a night or two, I gathered my pillows and prepared for bed. The bedroom felt different at night. Colder, despite the rest of the house maintaining a comfortable temperature. The darkness seemed thicker here, less penetrable. I attributed it to unfamiliarity and stress, but as I lay down, my body remained tense, every sense heightened. The mattress felt unstable beneath me, tilting slightly with each small movement. The boards underneath created a strange resonance, amplifying every creak and settling sound the house made. Sleep came fitfully, broken by dreams of falling through floors into endless darkness. I woke the next morning feeling worse than when I'd gone to bed. My neck ached from unconsciously tensing throughout the night, and my sheets were damp with perspiration despite the room's chill. The boards had shifted during the night. I could see gaps between them that hadn't been there before, dark spaces that seemed to swallow the morning light filtering through the blinds. Work provided a welcome distraction, but by afternoon, dread had settled in my stomach like a physical weight. The thought of another night on that unstable platform filled me with anxiety I couldn't rationally explain. I considered sleeping on the couch again, but my back couldn't handle another night of that torture. Instead, I spent the evening researching the house's history online. The records were sparse and frustratingly incomplete. Built in 1987, the house had changed hands 6 times in 38 years, an unusually high turnover rate for a property in such good condition. Most sales occurred after very short ownership periods, some lasting less than a year. The listing descriptions remained consistently vague about the reasons for sale, using phrases like motivated seller and price to move. One detail caught my attention. A newspaper article from 2019 mentioned a structural investigation at the address following neighbor complaints about unusual nighttime disturbances. The investigation had been inconclusive, but the property had sold again just 3 months later. That night, I decided to document everything. I placed my phone on the nightstand, video recording enabled, and positioned a flashlight within easy reach. The precautions felt both necessary and ridiculous, insurance against fears I couldn't name. The mattress settled onto the boards with more movement than I remembered from the previous nights. Each board seemed looser, more willing to shift under my weight. As I lay down, I could feel them redistributing beneath me, creating an uneven surface that made finding a comfortable position nearly impossible. The first few hours passed without incident. I dozed intermittently, waking periodically to check the time. Around midnight, I noticed the temperature in the room had dropped further. My breath wasn't quite visible, but the chill penetrated the blankets, settling into my bones. The heating system couldn't be malfunctioning. The rest of the house remained comfortably warm. At 2:47 a.m., I woke to absolute silence. Not the normal quiet of a house at night, but something deeper, as if all sound had been sucked from the room. No hum from the refrigerator downstairs, no distant traffic, no settling creaks. Even my own breathing seemed muted, swallowed by the oppressive stillness. I lay motionless, every muscle rigid with attention, waiting for the normal sounds to return. The silence stretched on, becoming a presence in itself. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, the only sound in a world gone mute. Then I felt it. The first pull was so subtle I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. A slight downward tug at the foot of the mattress, as if someone had gently grasped the boards beneath and given them the smallest experimental pull. The mattress shifted maybe an inch, but in the profound silence the movement felt seismic. My mouth went instantly dry. Every nerve in my body fired at once, flooding my system with adrenaline. I gripped the sheets, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid to do anything that might provoke whatever was beneath me. 30 seconds passed. A minute. Just as I began to convince myself it had been my imagination, it happened again. This time, there was no mistaking it. Something beneath the floorboards pulled sharply at the wooden platform, causing the entire arrangement to shift toward the foot of the bed. The mattress tilted noticeably, and I had to brace myself to keep from sliding. The boards creaked and groaned, but underneath that sound was something else. A hollow rushing noise, like wind through a vast empty space. Terror crawled up my spine with icy fingers. This wasn't settling or structural issues. This was deliberate, intentional. Something was down there, and it knew I was here. I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking so violently I could barely operate the screen. The video was still recording, though in the darkness it would capture nothing. With trembling fingers, I switched on the flashlight app and aimed it toward the foot of the bed. The light revealed the gap between the mattress and the wall had widened significantly. Several boards hung at impossible angles, suspended by nothing visible, as if they were anchored to something below rather than resting on a foundation. The spaces between them had grown into genuine holes, not gaps between floorboards, but actual voids that seemed to extend far deeper than the space between floors should allow. A third pull came without warning, violent enough to jar my teeth. The mattress lurched toward the foot of the bed, and I slid with it, my feet hanging over the edge into emptiness. Cold air rushed up from below, carrying a smell like damp earth and decay. But it was the sound that broke my nerve. A low, hungry groaning that seemed to come from somewhere impossibly far below, as if the house sat atop a cavern that stretched down into the earth's core. I scrambled backward, clawing my way toward the headboard as another pull threatened to drag me into whatever waited beneath. The wooden platform disintegrated further with each tug, boards snapping and falling into darkness with echoes that took far too long to fade. The mattress began to sag in the middle, its edges still supported but its center sinking into a growing void. Panic overrode rational thought. I rolled off the side of the bed, landing hard on the solid floor of the bedroom. From this vantage point, I could see the full scope of what was happening. The entire center section of the room's floor had simply vanished, leaving behind a pit of absolute darkness. The mattress hung suspended over this void, held up only by its edges where they still contacted the remaining boards around the room's perimeter. Something moved in the darkness below. I didn't wait to see what it was. Grabbing my phone and fumbling for the door handle, I fled the room, slamming the door behind me. Even through the closed door, I could hear the continuing destruction. More boards snapping, the mattress groaning as it was pulled deeper, and underneath it all, that terrible, hungry sound growing louder and more insistent. I spent the rest of the night huddled on the living room couch, every light in the house blazing, calling anyone I could think of who might help. The moving company insisted they had no record of removing a bed frame or installing any wooden platform. The previous owners had disconnected their phone and left no forwarding address. The realtor's office wouldn't open for hours. At dawn, I forced myself to return to the bedroom door. My hands shook as I turned the handle, not knowing what I would find. The room looked exactly as it had when I'd first moved in. The mattress sat pristine and level on what appeared to be a perfectly normal bed frame, metal rails and proper box springs. exactly what I'd ordered. The floor showed no signs of damage or disturbance. Even my scattered belongings had been neatly arranged on the nightstand. The video on my phone showed nothing but darkness and the sound of my own panicked breathing. I moved out that afternoon, taking only what I'd brought with me. The realtor was surprisingly understanding about breaking the lease, almost as if she'd been expecting my call. She mentioned that the house had a history of short-term tenants, something about adjusting to the unique character of older homes. But I know what I experienced, and sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I still wake with the sensation of falling, my heart racing with the memory of that hungry darkness pulling me down into whatever waited beneath. The house went back on the market within a week. The listing mentioned recent improvements to the master bedroom flooring, and I'm sure the next tenant will find everything in perfect order when they move in, at least until 3 a.m. Story 12. Some places hold memories like stagnant water holds disease, dark, festering, and impossible to cleanse. The old gymnasium behind Jefferson High had always been one of those places for me, even before I understood why my skin crawled every time I walked past its crumbling brick walls. 23 years later, standing in the parking lot with my new security guard uniform scratching against my neck, I realized nothing had changed. The building still looked like a monument to decay, its windows black and reflective as dead eyes. I pulled the flashlight from my belt and checked the time. 11:47 p.m. My first shift as night security, and already my hands were trembling. Not from the cold. October in Michigan was brutal, but I'd worn worse weather than this. The trembling came from somewhere deeper, some primal recognition that I was walking back into a nightmare I'd tried to forget. The memory hit me as I approached the back of the building. I was 11 years old again, cutting through the alley behind the gym to avoid the bullies who waited for me on the main sidewalk. That's when I'd seen him, the homeless man with his makeshift camp tucked between the dumpsters and the building's rear wall. His tent had been a patchwork of blue tarps and gray canvas, held together with duct tape and desperation. But what I remembered most clearly was the way he'd watched me. Not threatening, not predatory, just watching, like he was memorizing every detail of my face. I'd told my mother about him when I got home that day. She'd made some calls, mentioned it to neighbors, maybe even contacted the police. I never saw him again after that. The tent had vanished within a week, leaving only a rectangle of dead grass and scattered cigarette butts. Now, walking around the same corner with my flashlight cutting through the darkness, I stopped dead. My breath caught in my throat, creating a visible cloud in the frigid air. The tent was there. Not a similar tent. Not some new homeless person who'd chosen the same spot. The exact same tent, down to the specific pattern of duct tape repairs and the way one corner sagged lower than the others. It sat in precisely the same location, as if it had never left. My pulse hammered against my eardrums. I blinked hard, certain I was seeing things, but when I opened my eyes, the tent remained. Worse, there was light inside it. A soft, warm glow that seemed impossible given the tent's obvious age and the complete absence of any power source nearby. I should have called it in immediately. Should have radioed the main office, reported an unauthorized campsite, let someone else deal with it. Instead, I found myself stepping closer, drawn by a curiosity that felt more like compulsion. The light inside the tent wasn't steady. It flickered and moved, casting dancing shadows against the canvas walls. As I got within 10 feet, I could hear something that made my skin prickle with goosebumps. The faint sound of rustling fabric, rhythmic and constant, like someone tossing and turning in their sleep. But that wasn't what made me drop my flashlight. Taped to the outside of the tent, at eye level, were photographs. Black and white prints, slightly faded but unmistakably clear. All of me. All from when I was 11 years old. Me walking to school. Me sitting on my front porch. Me playing in the backyard. Me cutting through this very alley, heading toward the tent for the first time. dozens of them, arranged in a careful pattern that suggested both obsession and organization. I picked up my flashlight with shaking hands, the beam dancing wildly as I tried to steady myself. The photographs were impossible. Even if the homeless man had taken them back then, how were they here now? How was any of this here now? The rustling inside the tent continued, but now I could discern a pattern to it. It wasn't random movement. It was deliberate, purposeful, like someone was arranging things, preparing. I backed away, my breathing coming in short, sharp gasps that burned my lungs in the cold air. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to leave, to radio for backup, to get as far away from this place as possible. But my feet seemed rooted to the cracked asphalt, and my eyes couldn't stop staring at those photographs. In one of them, I was looking directly at the camera. I remembered that moment now, the strange sensation of being watched, the way I'd turned and seen the tent but nothing else. He'd been photographing me even then, even during that first encounter. A new sound emerged from inside the tent. Soft scratching, like a pencil on paper, or like fingernails on fabric. The light inside grew brighter, and I could see a silhouette moving against the canvas walls. A human shape, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too angular, moving in ways that didn't match the rustling sounds. My radio crackled to life, making me jump so violently I nearly dropped the flashlight again. The dispatcher's voice was tinny and distant, asking for my first hourly check-in. I fumbled for the radio, my fingers numb with cold and fear. I tried to respond normally, to sound professional and calm, but my voice came out as a hoarse whisper. The dispatcher asked me to repeat myself. I cleared my throat and tried again, managing to confirm that all was normal at the gymnasium. But as I spoke, the movement inside the tent stopped completely. The scratching ceased. Even the rustling fell silent. It was as if whoever or whatever was inside had heard my voice and was now listening. I signed off quickly and clipped the radio back to my belt. The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the whistling of wind through the gaps in the building's siding. I waited, watching the tent, my breath forming increasingly rapid clouds in the frigid air. Then the light inside went out. Complete darkness. The tent became just another shadow among shadows, barely visible even with my flashlight trained on it. But I could still see the photographs, their white surfaces reflecting my beam like accusatory eyes. I forced myself to take a step backward, then another. My legs felt like lead, and every instinct I had was screaming conflicting messages. Run, stay, investigate, hide. The confusion was almost as terrifying as the tent itself. That's when I heard the zipper. The sound was unmistakable. The slow, deliberate opening of the tent's front flap. Metal teeth separating one by one, creating a gap in the canvas that revealed nothing but impenetrable blackness inside. I should have run then. Every survival instinct I possessed was firing at once, flooding my system with adrenaline and demanding immediate flight. But something kept me frozen in place, staring at that growing opening in the tent. A hand emerged, pale, unnaturally long fingers, followed by a wrist and forearm that seemed to stretch further than any human limb should. The hand moved with deliberate slowness, feeling along the outside of the tent until it found one of the photographs. It traced the edges of the image with one finger, a gesture that was almost tender. My heart was beating so hard I was certain it could be heard across the parking lot. Sweat poured down my back despite the cold, and my mouth had gone completely dry. I wanted to look away, wanted to close my eyes, but found myself trapped by the hypnotic horror of what I was witnessing. The hand withdrew into the tent, taking the photograph with it. A moment later, it emerged again, this time holding something new. A fresh photograph. Even from my distance, I could see it was another image of me, but not from when I was 11. This one showed me from tonight, from just minutes ago, standing exactly where I was standing now. The impossibility of it broke something loose in my mind. I stumbled backward, my legs finally responding to the panic that had been building in my chest. The flashlight beam swayed wildly as I moved, creating a dizzying light show across the tent and the surrounding wall. As I retreated, More sounds began emanating from inside the tent. Not rustling now, but whispers. Soft, unintelligible murmurs that might have been words in a language I didn't recognize. The voices, because I was now certain there were multiple voices, overlapped and intertwined, creating a symphony of susurration that seemed to follow me as I backed away. I reached the corner of the building and pressed myself against the brick wall, my entire body shaking. The whispers continued, sometimes rising to an almost audible level, before fading back to barely perceptible murmurs. And underneath it all, a new sound that made my blood run cold. The soft pat-pat-pat of bare feet on asphalt. Someone was walking around the tent, circling it. The footsteps were deliberate and measured, as if whoever was making them was performing some kind of ritual. With each circuit, the whispers grew slightly louder, and I began to catch fragments that sounded almost like my name. I pressed my back harder against the wall, the rough brick scraping through my uniform shirt. My radio felt impossibly heavy on my belt, but I couldn't bring myself to call for help. How could I explain this? How could I describe what I was seeing and hearing without sounding completely insane? The footsteps stopped directly in front of where the tent's opening should be. The whispers cut off abruptly, creating a silence so complete that my ears began to ring. I held my breath, waiting, my lungs burning with the effort. Then, cutting through the silence like a blade, came a voice I recognized. My own voice, but not quite right. The cadence was off, the tone slightly higher, as if someone was doing an imperfect imitation. The voice was reciting my address from 23 years ago, the house where I'd lived when I was 11. Then my current address, then my phone number, my social security number, details about my life that no one should have known, delivered in my own distorted voice. I bit down on my knuckle to keep from crying out, tasting blood as my teeth broke the skin. The recitation continued, moving on to the names of my family members, my friends, my co-workers, people I hadn't thought about in years, details I'd forgotten myself. The voice paused, and in the silence that followed, I heard something that made my legs nearly give out completely, the sound of a camera shutter, click, and then another, click, and another, more photographs, being taken right now, of me hiding behind the building. I couldn't take it anymore. Whatever rational thought I had left evaporated in a burst of pure terror. I pushed myself off the wall and ran, my footsteps echoing off the surrounding buildings as I sprinted toward the parking lot. Behind me I could hear laughter, not from the tent, but from everywhere at once, as if the sound was being reflected off every surface. I reached my car and fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fit the key into the lock. As I finally got the door open, I made the mistake of looking back toward the gymnasium. The tent was gone. The entire area behind the building was empty, just cracked asphalt and scattered debris. No tent, no photographs, no sign that anything had been there at all. But as I stared at the empty space, my radio crackled again. This time, the voice that came through wasn't the dispatcher. It was my own voice, the same distorted version I'd heard from the tent, speaking words I'd never said. "Thank you for coming back. I've been waiting so long to see you again." I ripped the radio from my belt and threw it onto the asphalt, where it shattered into pieces. Then I got in my car and drove away, leaving rubber marks on the pavement in my haste to escape. I never went back to that job. I called the next morning and quit, claiming a family emergency. The security company was understanding, even offered to hold the position for me if I needed time off instead. But I knew I would never return to that place. And I knew, with a certainty that went deeper than rational thought, that somewhere out there, in some impossible space between memory and reality, the tent was still standing, still lit from within, still waiting. And every night since then, just before I fall asleep, I hear the faint sound of a camera shutter clicking in the darkness outside my window. Story 13. The fluorescent lights above my desk flickered with that particular kind of persistence that meant they were dying, casting intermittent shadows across the scattered blueprints and coffee-stained papers that had become my prison for the past 14 hours. The Meridian Building's 32nd floor felt like a tomb at 2:47 a.m., the kind of sterile corporate purgatory where the heating system groaned like something wounded, and the elevator cables sang their metallic lullabies in the shaft beyond the walls. Everyone else had abandoned ship hours ago, leaving me alone with quarterly projections and the growing certainty that I was losing my mind one spreadsheet at a time. That's when I heard it, the scratching. My fingers froze over the keyboard, every muscle in my body suddenly rigid as steel cable. The sound came from behind me, from the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city's sprawling darkness. Fingernails on glass, deliberate, rhythmic, like someone tapping out Morse code with their bare hands. The rational part of my brain, what was left of it after 15 straight hours of mind-numbing data analysis, immediately offered explanations. Tree branches in the wind, though we were 32 stories above the tallest oak. Thermal expansion of the building materials, though the scratching followed no pattern that physics would recognize. A window washer working the graveyard shift, though even I wasn't desperate enough to believe that particular fantasy. I turned around slowly, my desk chair creaking like old bones, and my heart stopped. She stood pressed against the window, her face mere inches from the glass. Water streamed down her pale skin in rivulets, her dark hair plastered against her skull like seaweed. The satin dress she wore clung to her thin frame, once white, but now the color of old bone, translucent with moisture. Her fingernails, too long, too sharp, scraped against the window in that same methodical pattern. But it was her eyes that made my throat close up like a fist. They were completely black, not just the pupils but the entire visible surface, like looking into twin wells that had never seen sunlight. Then she opened her mouth and made a sound that shouldn't have been possible for a human throat to produce. A mewing, guttural cry that rose and fell like a cat in heat, but wrong, distorted, as if someone had recorded the sound and played it back through a broken speaker. The vibration seemed to pass through the glass, through my bones, settling in my chest cavity like a parasite. My hands shook so violently that I knocked over my coffee mug, sending cold dregs splashing across my keyboard. The sound seemed to snap something in my brain back to attention. I blinked hard, once, twice, desperate to clear whatever hallucination my exhausted mind had conjured. When I opened my eyes, she was gone. The window showed nothing but my own reflection staring back, wide-eyed and pale as milk. The city lights twinkled 40 floors below like fallen stars, undisturbed and normal. No woman. No water streaks on the glass. No evidence that anything had happened at all. I sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, my heart hammering against my ribcage so hard I could feel it in my throat. Sweat had broken out across my forehead despite the building's Arctic air conditioning, and my mouth felt like I'd been chewing cotton. Every rational explanation I could conjure seemed pathetic and insufficient. Sleep deprivation, stress hallucinations, a migraine aura, though I'd never had migraines before. But the scratching sound had been so real, so impossibly, undeniably real. I forced myself to stand on unsteady legs and walk to the window. My reflection grew larger as I approached, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I saw movement behind my own image, as if something were swimming through the glass itself. I pressed my palm against the cool surface, searching for any trace of moisture, any evidence that what I'd seen had actually happened. The glass was bone dry. My reflection stared back at me, and I noticed how hollow my eyes looked, how the fluorescent lights carved shadows under my cheekbones that made me look skeletal. I looked like a man who was coming apart at the seams, which wasn't far from the truth. The overtime had been brutal lately, 60-hour weeks that blended into one continuous nightmare of deadlines and conference calls. Maybe I was finally cracking under the pressure, but as I turned away from the window, I caught something in my peripheral vision that made my stomach drop into my shoes. There, about halfway down the glass, were 4 parallel scratches in the surface, thin, precise lines that caught the light like silver threads. They were exactly the width of fingernails. I stumbled backward, my legs hitting the desk chair and sending it rolling across the carpet. The scratches seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights, undeniable proof that something had been out there, something that had clawed at the window with enough force to score the supposedly unbreakable glass. My hands fumbled for my phone, fingers trembling so badly I could barely unlock the screen. I needed witnesses. I needed someone else to see this, to confirm that I wasn't losing my grip on reality. The security guard would have to do. Marcus answered on the third ring, his voice thick with the kind of drowsiness that comes from too many overnight shifts. When I explained that I needed him to come up to the 32nd floor immediately, he seemed more concerned about my obvious panic than curious about the reason for it. The elevator took an eternity to arrive, and when the doors finally opened to reveal Marcus's reassuring bulk, I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders. He was a good man, Marcus. Former military, the kind of guy who'd seen enough real problems to not dismiss someone's concerns out of hand. But when I led him to the window and pointed out the scratches, his expression shifted from concern to something that looked uncomfortably like pity. There were no scratches. The window was pristine, without so much as a fingerprint to mar its surface. Marcus ran his flashlight beam across every inch of the glass while I stood behind him, my mouth opening and closing like a fish drowning in air. The scratches had been there. I had seen them, touched them, felt the sharp edges under my fingertips. Marcus suggested I should head home, get some rest, maybe see a doctor if the stress was getting to me. His voice carried the careful, measured tone people use when they're talking to someone they think might be dangerous. I found myself nodding and agreeing, desperate to appear normal, to convince him and myself that everything was fine. After he left, I gathered my things with mechanical efficiency, my hands moving through the familiar motions while my mind raced in circles. The logical part of my brain had reasserted control, offering reasonable explanations for everything I'd experienced. Hallucinations brought on by exhaustion, phantom scratches that my stressed mind had projected onto the glass. A perfectly normal breakdown, the kind that happened to overworked executives every day. But as I waited for the elevator, I made the mistake of glancing back at the window one more time. The scratches were back. 4 parallel lines, exactly as I'd seen them before, gleaming under the fluorescent lights like fresh wounds. My knees nearly buckled, and I had to grab the wall for support. This wasn't possible. Marcus had just examined every inch of that window. The scratches hadn't been there 30 seconds ago. The elevator arrived with a cheerful ding, and I stumbled inside, jabbing the button for the lobby with a shaking finger. As the doors began to close, I caught a glimpse of movement outside the window. A pale shape pressed against the glass, fingers splayed wide, leaving new scratches with each desperate scrape. The mewing sound followed me down 32 floors. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face pressed against the window. Those black holes where her eyes should have been, water streaming down her cheeks like tears. I called in sick the next day, then the day after that. My supervisor left increasingly irritated voicemails that I deleted without listening to completely. By the third day, I convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Stress-induced psychosis was a real phenomenon, documented and treatable. I made an appointment with my doctor, who prescribed sleeping pills and suggested a vacation. I felt better already, more grounded, ready to face the world again. That night, I returned to the office. The building felt different in the dark, less like a modern corporate monument and more like something older and more primitive. The security desk was unmanned. Marcus had called in sick, according to the temp who'd replaced him, and the elevators seemed to take longer than usual to respond to my summons. When I reached my floor, every instinct I possessed screamed at me to turn around and leave. The familiar space felt alien now, shadows pooling in corners where I'd never noticed them before. The fluorescent lights buzzed with renewed malevolence, and the heating system's groans sounded almost like breathing. But I forced myself to walk to my desk, to turn on my computer, to pretend that everything was normal. Work would ground me. Work would remind me that I was a rational human being living in a rational world. I managed almost 2 hours before I heard the scratching again. This time, I didn't turn around immediately. I sat frozen at my desk, every muscle locked in place, while the sound grew louder and more insistent. The rhythmic scraping seemed to be coming from multiple windows now, as if she'd brought friends, or as if there were more of her, an army of wet women in satin dresses, all clawing at the glass with fingernails like razors. When I finally found the courage to look, the entire wall of windows was covered with them. Dozens of pale faces pressed against the glass, their black eyes reflecting nothing, their mouths open in silent mews that I could somehow hear anyway. Water streamed down the windows in sheets, turning the glass into a waterfall that caught and scattered the fluorescent light into prismatic nightmares. Their fingernails scored the surface with the persistence of rain, leaving scratches that appeared and disappeared like heat mirages. I ran. My feet carried me across the carpet, past the cubicles and conference rooms, toward the elevator bay. Behind me, the scratching grew frantic, desperate, as if they knew I was escaping. The elevator doors stood open, waiting, and I dove inside just as something heavy slammed against the windows hard enough to rattle the entire building. The lobby felt like salvation, bright and normal, and blessedly empty of wet women in ruined satin. I burst through the front doors and into the cool night air, my lungs burning as I gulped down breath after breath of the city's smoggy atmosphere. Above me, the Meridian building stretched into the darkness, its windows glowing like amber eyes. All except the 32nd floor, which was dark. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time, staring up at those empty windows, trying to convince myself that what I'd seen was impossible. Buildings didn't harbor armies of supernatural women. People didn't claw their way through reinforced glass 32 stories above the ground. Reality had rules, and I was a rational person who understood those rules. But when I finally worked up the courage to go back, the next morning, accompanied by building security and a very patient police officer, we found evidence that someone had been there. The elevator had been called to the 32nd floor sometime around 3 a.m., according to the building's electronic logs. Several windows showed scratches that the building maintenance supervisor swore hadn't been there during his last inspection. And there, on the floor outside the elevator, lay a single piece of evidence that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. A wedding veil. It was yellowed with age and soaked through with what looked like dirty water, though it left no puddle on the carpet. The fabric felt wrong under my fingers, too cold and slightly slimy, like something that had been underwater for a very long time. The maintenance supervisor said it must have been left behind by vandals, teenagers playing pranks, though he couldn't explain how they'd gotten into the building or reached the 32nd floor without triggering any alarms. The police officer took a statement and filed a report that would disappear into a bureaucratic black hole, just another weird incident in a city full of them. The building security upgraded their cameras and hired additional guards for the overnight shift. Everyone had a rational explanation, a logical solution to an irrational problem. But I knew better. I transferred to a different department, one housed in a ground floor office across town. I sleep better now, though I still wake sometimes to the sound of fingernails on glass. My doctor says the nightmares will fade with time, that trauma has a way of working itself out if you give it space to breathe. He's probably right. But sometimes, when I'm walking past tall buildings late at night, I find myself looking up at the darkened windows, searching for pale faces and black eyes, and sometimes, God help me, I think I see them looking back. The veil sits in an evidence locker somewhere, slowly rotting in its plastic bag. The scratches on the windows have been buffed out and replaced with new glass. The rational world has reasserted itself, sweeping away the impossible and filing it under unexplained phenomena. But I remember the sound she made, that mewing cry that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than any human throat should reach. I remember the feeling of being watched by something that existed in the spaces between rational thought, something that fed on the loneliness of late-night workers and the desperation of those who'd lost their way. And I remember that in the end, she wasn't trying to get in. She was trying to get out. Story 14. The forest doesn't forget what we refuse to remember. The morning mist clung to the mountainside like smoke from a dying fire, and something about the way it moved, deliberate, almost conscious, made my skin crawl before I'd even set foot on the trail. I should have turned back then. Should have listened to that primal whisper in my brain that screamed wrong, wrong, wrong as I shouldered my hiking pack and stepped into the tree line. But I didn't listen. I never do. My name is Marcus Reed, and I've been documenting abandoned industrial sites across the Pacific Northwest for the better part of 5 years. Ghost towns, defunct mining operations, forgotten lumber camps, places where progress went to die and nature slowly reclaimed what humanity had carved away. It's solitary work, the kind that attracts loners and obsessives, and I suppose I qualify as both. The trail I'd chosen that October morning wasn't on any official map. I'd found references to it buried in century-old logging records, mentions of a sawmill operation that had supposedly run from 1923 to 1931 before mysteriously shutting down. No explanation in the documents I'd uncovered, no bankruptcy filings, no accident reports, no environmental violations. The Pacific Lumber Company had simply marked the site as discontinued operations and walked away. That should have been another warning sign. The path began innocuously enough, a barely visible deer track that wound between towering Douglas firs. But as I climbed higher, following the faint indentations in the forest floor, the vegetation began to change. The underbrush grew sparse, then disappeared entirely. The trees, though massive, seemed somehow wrong, too straight, too evenly spaced, as if they'd been planted rather than grown wild. My breathing grew labored as the trail steepened, not just from exertion, but from an inexplicable tightness in my chest. The air felt thicker here, pregnant with moisture, and something else I couldn't identify, something that made my nose itch and my eyes water. After 2 hours of climbing, I heard it, the distant sound of running water, but it wasn't the cheerful babble of a mountain stream. This was deeper, more rhythmic, like machinery grinding in slow motion. I picked up my pace, pushing through a stand of alders, and suddenly broke into a clearing. And there it was. The sawmill sat in a perfect circle of flat ground, as if the earth itself had been leveled by some massive press. The main building was a long, low structure of weathered gray wood, its peaked roof still intact despite what should have been nearly a century of abandonment. Smaller outbuildings clustered around it like nervous children seeking shelter. But it was the condition of everything that made my blood run cold. The buildings weren't ruins. They weren't overgrown with moss and ivy like every other abandoned structure I'd ever documented. They looked maintained, preserved. The wood showed no rot, no warping from decades of mountain weather. The windows were boarded up with fresh-looking planks, their edges sharp and clean. Even the massive water wheel at the side of the main building appeared functional, its wooden spokes dark with recent moisture. I stood at the edge of the clearing for several minutes, my camera hanging forgotten around my neck, trying to process what I was seeing. This place should have been a pile of moldering timber and rusted metal. Nature should have reclaimed it decades ago. Instead, it looked like the workers had left yesterday. My hands trembled as I raised the camera and began shooting. Through the viewfinder, the scene became even more unsettling. The shadows fell wrong, too deep and angular for the overcast sky above, and in several shots, I could swear I saw movement in the spaces between the buildings, quick, furtive shapes that vanished when I tried to focus on them. I forced myself forward, my boots crunching on gravel that was far too clean and evenly distributed. As I approached the main building, I noticed details that made my stomach clench. The metal fixtures on the doors showed no rust. The wooden trim had been recently oiled. Someone, or something, was keeping this place in perfect condition. The sound of running water grew louder as I circled the building, and I discovered its source. A stream ran directly beneath the structure, channeled through a series of wooden sluices that looked like they'd been constructed yesterday. The water was dark, almost black, and moved with an odd, viscous quality that reminded me uncomfortably of blood. I found a door on the north side of the building, its heavy timber construction unmarked by weather or age. A new padlock secured it, the brass gleaming in the filtered sunlight. But when I tested the door, it swung open easily. The lock was merely decorative, unfastened. The hinges moved without so much as a whisper. Inside, my worst fears were confirmed. The sawmill was operational, not just preserved, but actively maintained. Massive circular saws hung suspended from the ceiling, their teeth sharp and clean. Conveyor belts stretched the length of the building, their rubber surfaces supple and unmarked. Hand tools lined the walls in neat rows. Hammers, chisels, measuring devices, all looking like they'd just been cleaned and organized. But there were no cobwebs, no dust, no animal droppings or insect nests. The building was sterile in a way that felt profoundly unnatural. I moved deeper into the structure, my footsteps echoing strangely in the cavernous space. The smell hit me then, not the musty odor of abandonment I'd expected, but something clean and sharp. Pine sap, mixed with machine oil, and underneath it all, a metallic tang that made my mouth go dry. At the far end of the building, I found the office. Unlike the main floor, this space felt lived in. A desk sat in the center, its surface covered with papers that looked fresh despite their yellowed edges. I approached cautiously, my heart hammering against my ribs. The documents were work orders, timesheets, productivity reports, all dated from 1931. The handwriting was clear and precise, as if the ink had dried minutes ago rather than decades. But it was the final entry that made my blood freeze. October 15th, 1931. Final shift completed. All personnel accounted for. Site preparation for transition complete. Awaiting next phase. Today was October 15th. My hands shook as I photographed the documents, the camera's autofocus struggling in the dim light. Each click of the shutter seemed to echo longer than it should, bouncing off the walls and returning changed, distorted. I had to get out. I backed away from the desk, my breathing rapid and shallow. The walls seemed to press closer with each step, and the shadows in the corners moved independent of any light source. The sound of running water beneath the building had changed, becoming more mechanical, more purposeful. I ran. I crashed through the door and sprinted across the clearing, not caring about the equipment I'd dropped or the photos I'd failed to take. Behind me, I could hear the building settling, creaking in ways that sounded almost like whispers. The water wheel began to turn, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck, 3 miles down the mountain. My hands shook so violently I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine turned over on the 4th try, and I drove down the winding mountain road faster than was safe, my eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror for something I couldn't name but deeply feared. At home that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stumbled into something far beyond an abandoned sawmill. I'd built my career on documenting places where the past lingered, but this was different. This felt active, purposeful, as if the site existed in some temporal bubble where 1931 had never ended. I spent hours researching the Pacific Lumber Company, digging deeper into records I'd only skimmed before. What I found made my unease crystallize into genuine terror. The company had operated 17 sawmills across Oregon and Washington. 16 had closed due to economic pressures, accidents, or resource depletion. The 17th had simply vanished from all records after October 15, 1931. No closure documents, no final inventory, no disposition of assets. The mill had existed one day and been forgotten the next, as if some bureaucratic hand had reached into history and erased it. But I had been there. I had photographs. Except when I reviewed my camera's memory card, half the images were corrupted. Static-filled frames showed glimpses of the clearing, but the buildings appeared blurred, indistinct, as if they existed only partially in our reality. The photos of the interior were completely black, despite the adequate lighting I remembered. Only one image had captured anything useful, the final entry in the logbook. But even that photo showed signs of digital decay, the text fragmenting at the edges as if the information itself resisted documentation. I needed to go back, not because I wanted to, but because I had to understand what I'd encountered. The rational part of my mind insisted there had to be an explanation, some historical society maintaining the site perhaps, or a private collector with too much money and time. But my gut knew better. 3 days later, I returned to the mountain. This time I brought a GPS unit, determined to mark the exact coordinates of the sawmill. I also carried a small video camera, hoping motion capture might succeed where still photography had failed. The hike up the mountain felt different this time. The trail seemed longer, more convoluted, as if the path itself was reluctant to lead me back to the clearing. I stopped frequently to check my GPS, making sure I hadn't taken a wrong turn, but the device showed I was following the same route I'd taken 3 days earlier. When I finally broke through the tree line where the clearing should have been, my legs nearly gave out. There was nothing there. No sawmill, no outbuildings, no artificially leveled ground. Instead, I found myself standing in a natural meadow covered with young grass, the kind that springs up in areas recently disturbed by fire or logging. Wildflowers dotted the green expanse, swaying gently in a breeze that carried only the clean scents of pine and earth. I walked the entire area, my GPS confirming these were the exact coordinates I'd recorded from my previous visit. But there was no sign that any structure had ever existed here. No foundation stones, no rusted metal, no depression in the earth where buildings had stood. The stream was still there, but it ran clear and cheerful, nothing like the dark, viscous flow I remembered. I spent 4 hours searching, expanding my radius, checking and rechecking my coordinates. The GPS insisted this was the right place, but my eyes saw only pristine wilderness. As the sun began to set, I found myself kneeling in the center of the meadow, my hands pressed against the soft earth. The grass felt real enough, cool and slightly damp, but underneath it, I could swear I felt something else. A faint vibration, rhythmic and mechanical, like machinery running far below. When I pressed my ear to the ground, I heard it clearly. The sound of saws cutting through timber, the splash of the water wheel, the distant murmur of voices calling instructions to one another. The sawmill was still there, operating in some parallel space just beneath the surface of reality. And somewhere in that impossible place, workers were completing their final shift, over and over again, trapped in an endless October afternoon in 1931. I drove home that night with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. In my rearview mirror, the mountain looked different, darker, more angular, as if its very shape had shifted while I wasn't watching. At home, I tried to research the meadow, looking for any historical record of what might have stood there before. But every search led to dead ends, broken links, or documents that appeared to exist one moment and vanish the next. It was only when I was reviewing my corrupted photos one more time that I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the background of one image, barely visible in the static, was a figure standing among the trees at the edge of the clearing. A man in work clothes and a cloth cap, watching me with an expression I couldn't make out. But it was his shadow that made me slam the laptop shut, because while the figure stood in full daylight, his shadow fell upward, reaching toward the sky like grasping fingers. I've never returned to that mountain, but sometimes, usually in the hour just before dawn, I can hear the distant sound of machinery carried on the wind. And on October 15th of each year, I find myself drawn to my window, staring at the mountain silhouette and wondering if somewhere in the space between seconds, between one heartbeat and the next, a sawmill continues its endless operations. The forest doesn't forget what we refuse to remember. And some places exist not because they were built, but because they were needed. And some needs transcend time, space, and the comfortable boundaries of what we call reality. I still document abandoned places, but I've learned to trust my instincts more. When a location feels wrong, when the shadows fall upward and the past refuses to stay buried, I turn around and walk away. Because some doors, once opened, can never really be closed again. And somewhere in the mountains of Oregon, a sawmill continues its work, cutting timber that grows in forests that exist only in memory, staffed by workers who punched out nearly a century ago, but never quite found their way home. The sound carries on clear nights, if you know how to listen. The rhythmic cutting of saws, the splash of the water wheel, and underneath it all, the whispered voices of men calling to one another across the years, forever completing a shift that has no end. Story 15. The fluorescent lights hummed with an electrical malevolence that seemed to seep into my bones as I pushed the medication cart down the sterile corridor. Something was wrong with this place tonight. I could feel it crawling beneath my skin like a fever that hadn't yet broken. My name is Marcus, and I've been working the night shift at Riverside Medical Center for 3 years. 3 years of walking these halls when the world outside sleeps, when the boundary between life and whatever lies beyond grows thin as gauze. Tonight felt different, though. The air itself seemed to pulse with an expectancy that made my teeth ache and my hands tremble as I gripped the cart's metal rails. The medication rounds had started routinely enough. Room 204 received her insulin without incident, though Mrs. Henderson had mentioned seeing shadows moving in her peripheral vision. I'd attributed this to the morphine drip, made a note in her chart, and moved on. Room 206 complained about the temperature, claimed he could see his breath despite the thermostat reading 72 degrees. Another note, another dismissal. But as I approached room 208, my chest began to constrict with an inexplicable dread. My pulse quickened, sending blood rushing through my ears with each heartbeat. The familiar weight of my stethoscope around my neck suddenly felt like a noose, pressing against my throat as I struggled to maintain steady breathing. Mrs. Caldwell had been admitted 2 days ago following complications from cataract surgery. The procedure had gone wrong, terribly wrong, leaving her completely blind. The doctors spoke in hushed tones about nerve damage and irreversible trauma, their clinical detachment doing little to mask their bewilderment at how routine surgery had resulted in such devastating consequences. I knocked softly before entering, though protocol demanded I announce myself regardless. The room was bathed in the sickly amber glow of a single bedside lamp, casting elongated shadows that seemed to writhe and dance across the walls. The woman lay propped against her pillows, her bandaged eyes turning toward the sound of my footsteps with unnerving precision. She spoke before I could introduce myself, her voice carrying an odd resonance that made the hair on my forearms stand upright. She mentioned feeling a presence in the room, something cold and persistent that had been troubling her since the previous evening. Her head tilted slightly, as if listening to sounds I couldn't hear, before her right hand rose slowly to point directly at my midsection. The words she spoke next would replay in my mind for months afterward. She claimed that a boy was sitting in my lap, and that he appeared to be cold. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet instantly, as if her words had summoned winter itself into the sterile confines of the hospital room. I looked down at my navy blue scrubs, expecting to see nothing but the familiar fabric I'd worn countless times before. Instead, I watched in horror as moisture began to form across my chest and stomach. Not sweat, but something far colder. Ice crystals materialized from nowhere, clinging to the cotton fibers before melting into rivulets of impossibly cold water that soaked through to my skin beneath. My breath caught in my throat as the sensation registered. The unmistakable feeling of small arms wrapped around my waist, the weight of a presence I couldn't see but could undeniably feel. The fabric of my uniform grew heavy with moisture, and I could feel the dampness spreading across my midsection like fingers of Arctic air reaching through my clothing to touch my skin directly. Mrs. Caldwell continued to stare in my direction with those bandaged eyes, her expression growing increasingly concerned. She mentioned that the boy seemed upset, that he was trying to communicate something important. Her voice carried a certainty that made my stomach lurch with nausea, as if she possessed knowledge of something I was only beginning to comprehend. The water droplets falling from my uniform struck the linoleum floor with soft, rhythmic impacts that echoed unnaturally in the small room. As I watched, paralyzed by disbelief and mounting terror, the droplets began to form patterns on the floor, not random splashes, but deliberate shapes that spelled out a single, chilling word. Stay. My hands began to shake uncontrollably, and I could feel sweat breaking out across my forehead despite the bone-deep cold that seemed to emanate from my midsection. The metallic taste of fear flooded my mouth, and my breathing became shallow and rapid as adrenaline coursed through my system. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to run from this impossible situation. But my legs felt rooted to the floor as if the very ground beneath my feet had transformed into quicksand. Mrs. Caldwell's bandaged head turned slightly, as if following movement I couldn't perceive. She spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper, describing how the boy seemed frightened and alone. She mentioned that he appeared to be wearing old-fashioned clothing, a striped shirt and suspenders that suggested he'd been trapped in this place for decades. The sensation around my waist intensified, becoming almost unbearably cold. I could feel what seemed like small fingers pressing against my ribs, desperate and insistent. My teeth began to chatter despite my attempts to maintain composure, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the suddenly frigid air of the room. I managed to excuse myself from Mrs. Caldwell's room, though my voice sounded foreign and strained even to my own ears. The woman nodded knowingly, mentioning that the boy had followed me out into the hallway. Her words sent fresh waves of terror cascading down my spine as I backed toward the door, my eyes fixed on the wet letters still glistening on the floor. The corridor outside felt no warmer than the room I'd just vacated. If anything, the cold seemed to have followed me, clinging to my body like a second skin. My wet uniform chafed against my skin with each step, a constant reminder of the impossible encounter I'd just experienced. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting sporadic shadows that made every corner seem pregnant with unseen menace. Other staff members passed me in the hallway, but none seemed to notice anything unusual about my appearance or the water still dripping from my uniform. Their casual greetings and normal behavior only served to heighten my sense of isolation and growing madness. Was I experiencing some sort of breakdown? Had the stress of night shifts finally pushed my mind beyond its breaking point? I retreated to the staff break room, desperate for a moment to collect myself and attempt to process what had just occurred. The small space felt claustrophobic, its beige walls seeming to press inward as I sat heavily in one of the plastic chairs. My hands continued to tremble as I tried to make sense of the moisture still clinging to my uniform, the impossible coldness that seemed to emanate from within my own body. The break room's fluorescent light buzzed overhead with increased intensity, its irregular rhythm matching the erratic beating of my heart. I closed my eyes and tried to focus on my breathing, employing the stress management techniques I'd learned during my training. Deep breaths in, slow exhales out. Count to 10. Find your center. But even with my eyes closed, I could feel it. The presence that Mrs. Caldwell had described. The sensation of being watched by unseen eyes, of sharing space with something that shouldn't exist. The weight around my midsection hadn't diminished. If anything, it seemed to be growing heavier, more insistent. When I opened my eyes, the condensation on my uniform had reformed into new patterns. This time, the water droplets spelled out a different message across my chest. Help. The letters were perfectly formed, as if written by an invisible hand using the moisture as ink. My breath caught in my throat as I watched additional droplets form and fall, creating a small puddle at my feet that reflected the harsh fluorescent light above. The temperature in the break room plummeted further, and I could see my breath forming thick clouds with each exhale. Frost began to accumulate on the metal surface of the refrigerator, and the coffee in my abandoned mug developed a thin skin of ice across its surface. The cold was no longer just sensation. It was a living thing, wrapping itself around me like a burial shroud. I knew I couldn't continue my rounds in this condition, but the thought of abandoning my patients filled me with professional guilt that competed with my mounting terror. Mrs. Caldwell had described the presence as a boy, young and afraid, seeking comfort or perhaps trying to communicate something vital. Despite my fear, I felt a growing obligation to understand what was happening, to help if possible. The remainder of my shift passed in a haze of barely controlled panic and supernatural encounters. In room 210, Mr. Garcia mentioned feeling inexplicably cold and complained about wet spots appearing on his bedsheets despite the room's dry heating system. Mrs. Thompson in 212 asked why there were puddles forming around my feet, her voice thick with sedatives but her observation unnervingly accurate. Each room I entered seemed to amplify the presence clinging to me. The invisible weight around my waist grew more pronounced, and I began to feel what could only be described as small hands gripping my uniform, as if desperate to maintain contact. The sensation was simultaneously heartbreaking and terrifying, the touch of something lost and frightened, reaching across an impossible divide to make contact with the living world. By 4 a.m., my uniform was completely soaked despite the supernatural cold that should have frozen the moisture solid. Water continued to drip steadily from the fabric, forming messages and patterns on the floor wherever I walked. "Don't leave," appeared near the nurse's station. Scared formed a puddle outside the medication room. Alone, dripped across the threshold of the supply closet. The other night, staff began to notice my condition, though their reactions varied from concern to bewilderment. Sarah, the charge nurse, approached me near the end of my shift with genuine worry etched across her features. She mentioned that I looked pale and suggested I might be coming down with something. Her offer to cover my remaining rounds was tempting, but something kept me moving through the motions of my duties. As dawn approached and the day shift began to arrive, I found myself back in Mrs. Caldwell's room for one final check. The woman seemed to sense my presence immediately, her bandaged head turning toward me with that same unnerving precision. She spoke softly about the boy, mentioning that he seemed calmer now, less agitated than he'd been during the night. She described how the presence had been wandering the halls of the hospital for what felt like decades, lost and unable to find peace. The trauma of his situation, she didn't elaborate on the specifics, had bound him to this place, seeking someone who could acknowledge his existence and perhaps help him find rest. Mrs. Caldwell's next words sent chills through my already frozen body. She mentioned that the boy had chosen me specifically, drawn to something in my nature that made me capable of perceiving him when others could not. The responsibility of this revelation weighed heavily on my shoulders, adding emotional burden to the physical manifestations I'd been experiencing throughout the night. The moisture on my uniform began to warm slightly as the first rays of morning sunlight filtered through the room's window. The weight around my waist gradually lessened, though it didn't disappear entirely. Mrs. Caldwell smiled, the first expression of peace I'd seen on her face since her admission, and mentioned that the boy seemed satisfied, at least for now. I completed my documentation and prepared to leave, though the events of the night had left me fundamentally changed. The cold presence had followed me home, a constant reminder of the thin barrier between our world and whatever lies beyond. Even now, months later, I can feel the subtle weight of small arms around my waist during quiet moments, the gentle pressure of someone seeking comfort and connection. The hospital administration never found an explanation for the mysterious puddles that appeared throughout the building that night, or for the consistently low temperatures recorded in multiple patient rooms. Mrs. Caldwell's sight never returned, but she spoke often about the boy she could sense in the halls, describing his presence with a maternal tenderness that suggested she'd appointed herself his guardian. I still work the night shift at Riverside Medical Center, though my perspective on the job has irrevocably altered. I've learned to acknowledge the presence that accompanies me, offering quiet reassurance during particularly cold moments when the weight around my waist becomes more pronounced. Sometimes I catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that shouldn't exist, but somehow do. The water still forms words occasionally, usually simple messages of gratitude or requests for continued companionship. I've stopped questioning the impossible nature of these encounters, instead accepting my role as a bridge between worlds that shouldn't intersect, but somehow do within these sterile walls. Mrs. Caldwell was discharged 2 weeks after our encounter, but she returns for regular visits, claiming she enjoys the peaceful atmosphere of the hospital. During these visits, she always asks about the boy, and I always assure her that he's doing well, that he's no longer afraid. These conversations bring her visible comfort, and I've come to understand that her blindness has opened her perception to truths that most of us cannot see. The night shift continues, each evening bringing its own challenges and supernatural encounters. I've learned to dress warmly beneath my scrubs, anticipating the bone-deep cold that accompanies my invisible companion. My coworkers have grown accustomed to finding small puddles in my wake, attributing them to leaky pipes or condensation issues that maintenance can never quite locate or repair. The boy, for I've come to think of him as such, remains a constant presence in my life, a reminder that some connections transcend the boundaries of life and death. His story remains largely mystery, communicated through fragments of sensation and the cryptic messages spelled out in condensation and ice. But his need for companionship, for acknowledgement of his existence, has become as much a part of my routine as checking vital signs and administering medications. In quiet moments during my rounds, I speak to him softly, offering reassurance and companionship across the impossible divide that separates us. The weight around my waist shifts slightly in response, a subtle acknowledgement that somewhere in the shadows of Riverside Medical Center, A lost soul has found the connection he'd been desperately seeking.